All right, we are live. Welcome to the show. We got a great one for you tonight. First things, though, I'd like to talk about our not only a sponsor, but a friend and somebody I'd give a shout out to regardless, Rami, the Reptile Super Shows. Rami's an excellent guy, puts on a hell of a show. The Pomona Show, January 11th and 12th. You got to see it. It's a very big expo. It's definitely one of the top must-see expos or ones to attend. Great for networking. Tons of people. Awesome venue. Easy to walk around. Not easy to walk the whole thing. It's massive. There's a lot to see there. And there's a lot of cool people. And that's actually one of my favorite shows to attend. The vibes, the people, all the different animal species, they're there. It's really cool. And then shout out, of course, to US ARC, our biggest supporter for the reptile hobby. We cannot survive without US ARC. Everybody, please donate, support US ARC. I'm pointing in the wrong spot. There's the logo. So anyway, everybody knows about US ARC pretty much. And if you haven't, and even if you can't donate, like and share their content. Anything helps. And then also, there's some exciting news. Next Friday, 9 a.m., so early, next Friday, 9 a.m., I will be on Morph Market with MJ doing an episode. And basically, the episode is going to cover what you should know about Hognose, buying Hognose from Morph Market, what you should look for, etc. And Morph Market and MJ are doing this this collaboration. I don't know if I guess it's a collaboration. And every Friday, MJ is going to be on at 9 a.m. with different breeders, and there's going to be market updates, market information. And so that's going to draw a whole new crowd of people that are on Morph Market that are just entering the reptile hobby. So it's a really good way to spread awareness for the community, get more people involved in the community. And yeah, it's going to be really cool because it's going to involve basically the market, the reptile community, Morph Market, etc. And so that's 9 a.m. I will be a guest for this. I'm not going to be there every time, but I'll be a guest this time. And we're basically going to discuss Morph Market, Hognose snakes, the Hognose market on Morph. Anyway, just wait, see it. And now let's get to Dave and our guest. I'm going to add them simultaneously. There's Dave. Oh, my God. Look at that sweater. Holy shit. And then Nick.
I'm still in awe of the sweater. The sweater reveal just like, whoa.
Yeah. It looks like
you guys never...
Yeah, from like a reel that one of my friends would send me. They're like, hey, check this fucking guy out.
It was in a movie. It's a Seth Rogen sweater.
Oh, it's a Seth Rogen sweater? What movie?
Yeah, in that one movie where they did the holiday movie where they always got back together with their old high school friends.
Oh, okay.
Got into shenanigans. There was drugs involved. You don't remember that?
I mean, I remember seeing the previews for the movie, but I haven't seen the movie. It's been what?
It might be Jingle All the Way, but I'm pretty sure it's not.
It's not Jingle All the Way, but that's a classic.
Oh, nice. The Last Night. It's called The Last Night.
It's nice meeting you, Nick. I've never met you before. This is our first kind of actual time interacting. I have seen clips and snips of you from on MJ's podcast, and Dave's talked about you and had highly regarded you with genetics information. And so how long have you been in the hobby, Nick, total?
It's hard to say. It depends on what you consider to start. I mean, I've had lizards and things as pets when I was, second, third grade.
Gotcha.
My whole life intermittently. When it became in the hobby proper, that's probably over 30 years though.
Wow.
And I've been breeding
carpet
pythons. What?
You're mainly carpet pythons?
What species? People think that, but I did the math, and I actually have 37 different species of python, which is about 3/4 of all the species of python that exist.
Wow.
I have most of them. So I have all the carpets, well, except for there's one you can't really obtain. But yeah, if you can have it, I probably have it. So
gotcha. So you pretty much have every species that's legally you're able to obtain.
Yeah, there's a few you can't get for various reasons, but I have every species of Lyasis, every Aspidites, every Antirrhetia, every Morelia. I have all 4 species of retics. I have rock pythons, Angolan pythons. I've got roughies. I've got, you name it. I've got Sri Lankan python. I have everything. If you can have it, I probably have it. there's only I think the only thing you can actually, there's only a couple species you actually could get that I don't have. And that's
Lisa asked if you still have Nada.
Yeah, actually I have one sitting in quarantine upstairs. I lost my last male, so I had to find another one. Because I have like a female I produced years back that's just sitting here all lonely. So, but they're very difficult to get. Nobody breeds them. They rarely come in.
I see. Is there any species of python that you want to get that is, you can actually obtain, but they're just really hard?
Yes, but if I say what that is, then it'll just work against me probably.
I got you. Yeah, no, I know the same thing. Like, people are like, Morph. Yeah.
There's species that people know exist, and then there's things that are clearly our species that people don't know exist because they don't even know they're species because they maybe haven't been published as such yet, but they clearly are. And with some of these species groups I work with, there's always a few guys that always seem like they're quicker on the draw than me. So if something comes in, they will just hoard every single specimen. I never get any. Because I'm like, so I'm not, I'd like to pass on that question.
Okay, I got
So there's several as yet unnamed species I'm trying to bolster my numbers of, but yeah.
Are your African rocks really big? Like, did you get them big, or did you kind of keep them at a maintainable size?
No, they're tiny. This is like rock pythons breed small, berms breed small. All these giant snakes will breed shockingly small. You don't need to let them get that big. In fact, it works against you past a certain point. My female rock python, I'll try to breed her again this year. She's in a 4-foot cage, comfortably in a 4-foot cage, comfortably. Like she doesn't need anything bigger than a large rat. And she laid 18 eggs. My male lives in a CB 110, and it's like, which is like it's as the equivalent of like almost 7 square feet of floor space. So it's a tub, but it's a very large, extremely large tub, but he's not cramped. They don't need to be that large. Rock pythons will breed very, very small.
How long is your female?
And smaller eggs. But what?
How long is your female, the African rock, like roughly?
I don't know. She's not the meanest snake I own, but I will say she is uncooperative. So I have not actually had occasion to stretch her out and try to measure her. And snakes are always longer than you think they are. So any number I threw out would probably be out wrong by a few feet, I would imagine. But yeah, not any bigger around than my wrist, really.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I'm surprised. Actually, when the funny thing is of all the species you mentioned, and then Dave asked about the African rocks, I was actually kind of interested about asking about them too, just because they do have a reputation for being highly defensive and getting very large, and even bigger than sometimes than berms.
Well, that's one of those things that's kind of been the size of your snakes thing, and understanding reptile growth rates has been kind of a crusade I've been on the last couple of years, I guess. Because it's so widely just misunderstood.
Yeah.
There's two concepts, and one of them doesn't really exist in snakes. There's the idea of like adult size. Adult size is just the size at which you achieve sexual maturity. And then there's this concept of maximum size. Well, fun fact, there's no such thing as maximum size for snakes because they're indeterminate growers. They never stop growing. If you keep feeding them, they'll just grow to unnaturally large sizes and die young. There's nothing that stops them from growing. So when you see a record in the wild of like a 30-foot rock python and there are records of occasional specimens that large, people always conflate that largest specimen with like an average adult specimen. So, it's like with scrub pythons, a group I do a lot of work with and everything, people like, whoa, I know the bar-neck scrub pythons can get 15 feet long, and in their mind that gets mistranslated into, I need to grow my bar-neck scrub python until it's 15 feet long, which is insane. Because it doesn't lay eggs? 15-foot scrub pythons. They don't do anything.
It's a funny... Yeah, it's the same thing with Hognose. I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm really excited that you're talking about this because it's the same thing with Hognose. And Hognose have high metabolic rates. So when you hit them with food, they get to these insane sizes. And the same thing, they make horrible friggin' breeders. They don't breed a lot of them.
Yeah. I have bred quite a number of scrub pythons over the years, multiple species of them. I've seen a lot of scrub pythons sitting on eggs. What I have never seen is a 15-foot scrub python sitting on a pile of eggs. Not once in my life, nor do I ever think that I will. Past a certain point, that animal can't really thermoregulate properly. It's like it takes too long to heat up and too long to cool down. It just doesn't work. And you can get away with that with like domesticated reticulated pythons or Burmese pythons that are so far removed from wild ancestry that the reproductive metrics are so, the goalpost has moved so far to the advantage of the keeper that you can get away with a lot of stuff that wouldn't work with other things. But when you have something like scrub pythons, where invariably 90% of your adults are going to be imports anyway, you don't have that benefit of 5 generations or 10 generations of selective or captive breeding to make it easier. So it just doesn't work. They don't regulate properly. They don't lay eggs. They reabsorb their follicles. So don't let them get too big and fat.
It's interesting. And then I wonder, like, the one thing I always equated it to is Hognose, that they have kind of like, I don't know, an internal clock. And the more you feed them, because like the way I could like see what you think of this, Nick. Like, you know, like a mouse and an elephant, like the mouse lives up to like maximum of 2 years, elephant like 80 years, but their hearts beat around the same amount of times because a mouse has a much higher metabolic rate. Reptiles are ectothermic, and their metabolic rate, their food, and their temperature is relating to, you know, their metabolism and how they experience time, essentially. Because at lower temps, lower heart rate, their body's experiencing time slower versus at a higher rate. Hognose snakes, high metabolism. If I'm keeping them really warm and then you feed them to these really gross sizes, they're actually equivalent to like probably a hognose 3 times older in the wild. And then like you're saying, it's like the African rock pythons, those real big ones. Yeah, those are probably like, what would you at? Those are probably like 30-plus-year-old snakes. They took forever, a very long time to get that size.
Well, this is I'm almost hesitant to get into this subject just because I know a lot about it and can go off quite a ways, but the conversation gets pretty wonky and pretty science driven. If people understood these concepts, they'd have better outcomes, or snakes would live longer. It'd be really powerful knowledge. But sometimes, in my experience, you try to explain something that's too complicated, a lot of people kind of tune out. I had to do a lot of research on this subject when I wrote the first carpet python book, and I've done more since. In that, basically, this is how aging works. At the end of all your chromosomes, there's a structure called a telomere. Every time that cell divides into 2 daughter cells, that telomere gets a tiny bit shorter. And eventually, there's no telomere left. And when that finally happens, that cell line dies. It can't divide anymore. Eventually, those 2 daughter cells die off, and that cell line dies. This is what we call aging. This is the basic driver of aging. Is what happens is your cell lines cannot replenish. Otherwise, you'd be immortal. If every cell's just regenerated forever, you'd never age. It's the slow buildup of cell lines that have depleted their telomeres and die off that can't be repaired. And the cumulative effect of that is what we call aging. Now, it's called a telomere clock. Okay. Reptiles are ectothermic. So their body temp, and this process is a metabolic process. If your metabolism is ectothermic and it's based on your temperature, keeping animals too warm, and any way you're forcibly ramping up their metabolism by overfeeding them, keeping them too warm. What do most people do? They overfeed and keep them too warm. You are forcing them into a higher metabolic gear than they should otherwise be. You are therefore speeding up their metabolism. Thus, you are speeding up the rate of cellular division and the depletion of the running out of the telomere clock. And your animals are actually aging. They grow, they get big, but they're aging faster metabolically than they should.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're explaining it like a really, really well, actually. This is like awesome.
With diamond pythons, the one kind of awkward cousin carpet python that inhabits a much more southerly latitude, they're so far south that they are diurnal instead of nocturnal. They're black scales. They're because it's cold. It's cold in the winter. It's cold at night. They're a cold adapted python. These animals are extremely long lived if kept correctly. But for the longest time, for 25 years in the U.S. hobby and in the European hobby, people thought they had a disease. They had invented an imaginary phantom disease they called diamond python syndrome. Whereas their snakes, when they were 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, would get brittle bones, chronic respiratory infections. They'd lose muscle tone, and they would just slowly crash. And it turns out that's not a disease. That's just bad keeping. When you keep them, people think, oh, it's like these other carpet pythons. I'll keep it like them. When you keep them at that higher temperature, a background temperature in the low 80s, yeah, it works fine for a while, or it seems to work fine, but you sped that metabolism up for this animal that inhabits a cold climate. You put it in the warm climate metabolic category, and you sped everything up. Yeah, the animal seems like it does great for 7 or 8 or 9 years, and then it crashes. It's like the aha moment for me was like looking at the symptoms of diamond python syndrome, and it's everything you find in a retirement home.
Yeah.
Brittle
Okay.
bone, poor muscle tone, lethargy, and pneumonia. Like it's like that's old age. Your snakes have just an animal that should have, and diamond pythons are known to live 30 years, a very long time. So this animal that should live 25, 30 years, no problem, is dying at 8 or 9 years old. Because you force, it's basically, think of the metabolism of these animals as like a mountain bike that has 21 gears. It's like they're in a way different gear. And if you force them into a really high gear and they're just pedaling for all they're worth, shit's going to wear out faster because they're not meant to be in that gear all the time. And you're just forcing that issue and you're just wearing the parts out fast because it's not how they're not geared to be that way. And that's what you're describing in hognose snakes.
Yeah.
It's the same thing you see in diamond pythons. Those are the diamond pythons, the extreme. It's an easy example because they are a cold tolerant python. So it's very, the symptoms are very pronounced. But you see a lot of big fat snakes that don't lay a lot of eggs and die young. So much so that if you were to ask, like, most people in the hobby would be shocked to know that pythons routinely should live to 25, 30 years because they've never seen one that old. Like, I've done this numerous times, like, just like, post a picture of any of your snakes that's over 20 years old, and it's nothing. I'm doing my little list of what I'm going to pair this year, and I've got any number of 20-year-old snakes that are probably going to breed this year. It's, my original water pythons are turned 20 years old this year. Like,
they should still reproduce at 22.
Yeah, what you find is with a lot of things, they never go through the concept of like menopause is something that like literally only humans do. And there's a little bit of research that chimpanzees maybe kind of sort of. That's not the rule in the animal kingdom. Fertility right up until death is the rule. However, what you find is frequently that fecundity and fertility sort of drop off. So you're, instead of breeding every year or every 2 years, it's every 3 years or 4 years. And instead of laying 15 eggs, it's like 6 eggs and some duds. It's, you do sort of peter out, but they can still go. But
I have a question. When it comes to keeping some of the larger scale ball python guys do an ambient temperature, do you think that ambient temperature being kept that way for 10 or 20 years is actually more beneficial for longevity with that animal?
No. I think you guys are all you're aggressively trying to make the weakest animals you possibly can. Adversity breeds strength in everything, in people, in any animal. The tougher your life is, the tougher you have to be to survive in it. And what do? You take these animals, you feed them an absolutely unimaginable amount of food for how to achieve an unnatural growth rate and an unnaturally early onset of sexual maturity. They sit on a piece of paper in a tub that has the perfect temperature all the time. They don't have to work for their food. It just encourages obesity, lethargy, and all these problems are just like you basically made the ultimate couch potato snake. They do nothing. They don't even have to kill their rats anymore. The rat's already freaking dead. They just, I'll just swallow this thing and then sit here mostly motionless until it shows up again next week. This is.
I feel like you've been holding that in since you saw the title of the podcast.
It is true, man. Like it is true. And we have all who keep snakes, particularly pythons and boas, which are low metabolic rate ambush predators anyway. We're all guilty of this. I think the ball python people are clearly the most guilty of it, but I myself have been guilty of it to some extent. I'm sure I still am guilty of it. And it comes at the expense of the longevity of the animals. But the problem is that in the ball python community, nobody will notice because nobody has 25-year-old ball pythons, because as soon as they're 3-gene female, as soon as they've got a 4-gene female that's ready to go, they sell that thing for 27 cents to the next guy. And that animal is going to have 9 or 10 or 12 different owners before it dies prematurely. And it'll be so far down the food chain, no one will even know how old it is. It's like nobody keeps that snake for its whole life. So they're never going to know that it didn't live its whole life. A ball python, geez, it is the longest lived snake known. Like we know they can live over 50 years, and that's not, and probably longer, but we know for a fact they can live a half a century, but nobody's keeping anything that long to know that. This idea that you should take a male ball python or any ball python and feed it a rat pinky every single freaking day so that it gets to reproductive size in just a handful of months is like so that is so wholly unnatural that there are going to be long-term consequences for that animal. But that animal is going to be 5 owners down the track before those consequences really come to bear. So it kind of is.
I agree, by the way. But I guess the reason I asked that, and it could be a general species question because some of these breeders do more ambient and take the hot spot away. But taking the hot spot away, slow the metabolism, or just slow them down, where they'd have a longer life. Not having the hot in the cool, or that's my thought process on that.
That would be there. There are no answers to these questions because no one's done any rigorous testing to find the answer. These are knowable things. It is possible to know, experiment, and figure this stuff out, but nobody wants to but it's the kind of thing where it takes years of work to do. You'd have to have an experimental group where they're just an ambient only thing, and somebody that has more dynamic temperatures, and you have to track everything over a long period of time and then compare results with a sizable enough sample size. But it's knowable, but nobody really has that data. The other metric with ball pythons and hognose to probably only a slightly lesser extent is that some of this stuff, the rules have changed and that they have become entirely domesticated. So if you were to take a group of wild-caught ball pythons, your outcome would not be as good. But what you can get away with most morph ball pythons that are now so far removed from wild ancestry and so many generations of captive breeding, those metrics are moved. So it's not necessarily this. It's not going to be the same as if you just got some fresh imports because they are domesticated.
So last question on this then. With some colubrid species, some breeders have found out over the years that you can do extended cooling periods or extended brumations. I'm sure you've heard some of the lengths that some people have done it or proved they can do it. We won't say those numbers out loud. But do you think that is shortening the life of the animal or actually extending the life of the animal?
Oh, it'll be extending the life of the animal for sure. Okay. Well, I can't say for sure. All evidence, if you look at all of what we know about these sorts of things, the only conclusion come to is to be almost certainly to lengthen life expectancy. This period of, they are not supposed to be, these are not animals that are even tropical pythons that, they have access to food year round. They're still boom and bust cycles that coincide with the wet and dry seasons. So they're not eating an even amount of calories throughout the whole year. There's going to be times when, there's seasonal availability of prey and you eat a crap load for 3 months. Then you're getting by on pretty meager amount of food the rest of the time. But that ramping up and down of metabolism and a body temperature and all those effects, that's the natural way it's supposed to be. Everything is level all the time, super easy, and the food just comes on a regular basis. And even the types of food we feed tend to be too nutritious. I mean, if anybody listen to this, if you've ever gone out and found pythons in the wild, it doesn't matter the species. What you'll always find is that they're never fat. They never had the luxury of excess body fat. They're always lean, muscular, half starved. They're getting by, but they're working hard to get there, Whereas our captive animals look like, bratwurst by comparison. They're plump, they're round, they're too well fed. And what we feed them the rodents we feed them are too well fed. I mean, no wild rat looks like a rat. I mean, they're because they're eating a laboratory diet. It's almost too good. They're overly nutritious.
Yeah, it's too fatty and rich.
Yeah, I mean, wild rodents don't have that luxury of having a lot of excess body fat either.
No, exactly. And so Dave says it's you're really into genetics as well.
Well, I need to understand what it is I'm doing, I guess.
Right. He said last time you were talking about spider ball pythons, enigma leopard geckos came up in topic, but you said you wanted to wait till you had me on or to talk more about the enigmas.
You are the gecko guy. Not that we're going to get a full-blown enigma, but we were talking about species across the industry that people have pretty much been okay with the mutation not being super viable, I guess is the way I put it, functional. But enigma, I mean, we could pick up on enigma.
I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the changing of the hobby. In the last 10 years, things have changed a lot. Now that social media and I say morals and ethics are definitely, looked at more and taken into consideration. At first it was kind of almost this animal is neurological. As long as it can live, it's cool, breed it. Now everybody especially newer people and a lot of people they're like, damn, it's really? So yeah, Enigma leopard geckos for a time were somewhat, they were acceptable to breed. And, you know, when we produced our first ones, well, when we got the first two adults, we weren't told that they had neuro issues. The one female kind of like pranced when she like run. And I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. I was like, this is a very unique leopard gecko, I guess. But it didn't tilt or anything like that. And it wasn't until we made like, you know, like about a dozen of them, we had some that were kind of tilting a bit. And then other people started talking about it. And then as you made more combinations, some of these combinations, and then just making more of them, you got this because, you know, it's variable. So you have the spectrum of it, and you have these ones that don't really express it. They doesn't matter. They can still make, you know, like Nick's going to know this, you know this. You can have a spider ball python that doesn't wobble, do nothing. Same with Enigma. You can have Enigma that's perfect. You can breed it. It has the same chance of making the same percentage of neuro issues as a really severe animal. I mean, that's like, you see that with Enigmas, and every now and then you still have people resurfacing every few years. It's like, it's interesting. It's part of this human psychology, or that's the aspect of it where they're like, every few years, somebody's like, oh, I'm going to outbreed this and get rid of the Enigma syndrome or spider ball python syndrome. And it's like, you're not changing the mutant gene that causes this variable penetrance defect. It's like, it's going to vary. It's going to be on a spectrum. So, you know, it seems like certain things can exacerbate it, you know, make it worse. More combinations, or another combination that tends to have neuro issues, obviously is going to make it worse. But the one thing about the Enigma leopard gecko, I wonder if they have actual, like, a structural issue with their skull around their ears, because like that's what Dave was telling me. Like, I don't know what part of the spider ball python, but he said that I just found this out recently. It's very interesting that the X-rays of the spider ball pythons, their skulls actually have a defect in the spiders where it's affecting either the quadrant bone or the part of the inner ear that, you know, causes them to have equilibrium issues of varying degrees.
I'm dubious of that claim because we see this same sort of mutation in a whole lot of other things. I'm not an expert on the Enigma leopard geckos. Is that a dead white super Enigma, I assume?
No, the Enigma leopard gecko is it's a pretty radical looking mutation. It's very pretty.
What does the homozygous expression look like?
Not too well. It is an incomplete, or closer to, like, you might even be able to argue it's dominant, because you don't see a huge difference in the homozygous and the heterozygous. Other though that, well, you do actually. The homozygous has even more neuro issues because you have two copies of this allele that are exacerbating it. But phenotypically, Enigmas are very variable. You can get lower expression and high expression ones, and nobody really made many homozygous. But it's not an all-white animal, and it's not lethal. I mean, it's not like,
yes. But did anyone actually bother to breed their homozygous Enigmas and actually prove that that was a homozygous Enigma?
I'm not sure. I know they did with Lemon Frost. I mean, there's enough people that bred Enigmas where somebody definitely hit the super form. You know what I mean? It'd be like, if somebody.
Yes,
like,
but what I'm saying is, like, people hit what they assume is a super form. Like,
yes, that's pretty much what
did that animal. Did any of them live to adulthood, then get bred to a normal to prove, in fact, statistically, that they were a super Enigma?
Not that I can like confirm, but there's enough Enigmas bred where it can be inferred that there was a super made. But like, I can't tell you exactly for sure. No.
That sort of thing.
Is that Max Snow, by the way, with the Enigma?
Yeah, it looks like a Max Snow.
Okay. Sorry.
Sorts of mutations, they're usually homozygous lethal. And with anything, if the embryo dies at an early enough stage, the homozygous embryo dies, you don't really know that it was in there. If you breed spider to spider ball, you're going to make super spiders. Most of the time, you're not even going to get to see what it looks like. You got 5 eggs. 1 egg died. Guess what was in the 1 egg that went dead? Shocker. It was your super spider. Only occasionally do they make it all the way to the finish line. They usually don't. And if it dies at halfway through, you don't know what it was. So it evades detection, or it makes it easier to deny the existence thereof. So that sort of stuff happens a lot. It's like, where's this? Well, it's like the super scoria boa. Gee, where's that at? Like, I wonder what it looks like. I'll tell you, it's going to be a dead white boa. If anybody ever has one that makes it that far into gestation without dying, it's going to be a dead white boa, because it's the same thing. It's like this same mutation has occurred a bazillion times in a bunch of different species, always this same sort of thing. And to say that their wobble is always associated with some inner ear issue, how does that lead you to a dead white homozygous animal at the same time. It seemed like your inner ear structure and like your utter lack of pigment are likely separate. So reconciling those two things with a single causal mechanism, i.e. a mutation, seems a little, I don't know. I'd want to see somebody make a pretty good case for how that would also explain that. Because in all those dead white snakes, whether it's any of the ball python variants that are all compatible het for dead mutations, or any of the other species you see them in, and it occurs in carpet pythons, it occurs in a bunch of different things. The homozygote is always the same. It is a white, mostly white animal, usually has a thumbprint-like smudge on the top of its head and no lungs. The lung in the snake versions doesn't develop. They only have one functional lung anyway, and the lung development never develops properly. They're born, it's like their chest is concave, and if they make it that far, they asphyxiate.
It's
either
like
drowning full term in the egg or very, very shortly thereafter. So I'm trying to find a way with the inner mutation affects the shape of your inner ear and your pattern, also knocks out all your pigment in a homozygous expression and denies you a lung. That doesn't seem like the same sort of thing.
You ever hear, the Appaloosa horse?
Yep.
The homozygous of that is that it has organs on the outside of its, on the outside of the organism. They don't form, but and actually, you may not know about this one, Nick, since you're more of like a python and boa guy. But African fat tail geckos, the whiteout. My dad and I are the originator of that one. The super form of that is lethal, and they have their organs on the outside of their stomach sometimes, or a little bit. Sometimes they're like kind of fully formed, and they have a large yolk sac. Their organs are actually on the inside. But they're like really weak and frail, and like you could like pip the egg for them. We never had one live longer than a day. But the whiteout though doesn't have neuro issues. But that's an interesting one because we made hundreds of whiteouts, and it wasn't until probably like 9 years after the release where some people started actually getting some neuro whiteouts. And anyway, the super form of the whiteout is lethal. It's kind of like a pied looking. It's like almost pure white, but it's got like blotching on its head and body. Sometimes its head's like real bluish looking, and sometimes their body would be like have like this really long, like kind of elongated stripe, and then the rest of the body's like snow white.
That would fall into the same sort of umbrella, like you.
Yes.
Ball pythons are very useful, even to non-ball pythons, since everybody knows enough about them. You can always,
right.
If explaining like a situation in this leopard gecko to people that don't know anything about leopard geckos, but you can also say, well, you can pull up an easy ball python analogy that 90% of people will understand. So as a learning vehicle, it's the same as look at in ball pythons. You have a whole lot of dead white snake producing allelic mutations and everything, and they're not all the same. A champagne doesn't look anything like a spider. It has a wobble. That people didn't notice for a good number of years. At least most people didn't notice. There was a good bit of a delay before anybody was talking about that. And then it makes a quasi-white snake that doesn't die right away, but never makes it to maturity either, does it? That's a much more closer analog. It's, it's not a totally white snake, but it's also jacked up, way goofed out, and it doesn't live to maturity. So that sort of
stuff. So it is allelic with the spider, I'm pretty sure, right?
Champagne?
Champagne, I thought is I thought champagne's a little with spider.
It is, and it's so much
the wobble complex.
A group of snakes that have more lies and bullshit told about them than that group of snakes, but over this many years, the champagne, the woma, the hidden gene woma that has no hidden gene in it, all that stuff's allelic. Any one bite to itself makes a dead white snake. Any of them to any of the other ones makes a white snake that is either dead or will die soon after.
What's the connection that where you're talking about all these like wobble trait animals? Typically the super form is a snake with no pigment. What do you think the correlation, like why is that with that? Because you can make white snakes in these species with other combinations. What is that with that always happens?
Okay, I did a lot of looking into on this because it pertains to the jaguar morph in carpet pythons, and why all carpet people have to name all their morphs after big cats, I don't know. They seem to. Everything's named after a big cat. It's weird, but at any rate, the jaguar mutation, same exact thing as the spider. Same, incomplete dominant, somewhat wobbly with some variability, reduced pattern, clear ventral surface, pale eyes, dead white snake with no lung for the homozygous. Same thing. And what you find is there has been absolutely no research done in these mutations in snakes, because why would anybody do that? But there has been a bunch of research done into domesticated livestock that these same mutations occur in laboratory animals. There's been a bunch of stuff done with mammals and stuff, and you see broad sort of similarities. One thing that came up over again and over again is you have the two basic types of mutations you have are pigment synthesis and pigment distribution. An albino is just a failure to make a pigment. Doesn't really cause a lot of problem. That type is always recessive and never really causes much problem. But the second type does. If you look at mutations that have problems, they're always the pattern mutations. They're never the color mutations, are they? It's never the hypo that is, rarely is there a hypo that is screwed up. But when you start rearranging where pigment goes, that's where you get into trouble. Look at it, think of any mutation in any species, it's a train wreck. It's always a pattern mutation, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, I'd say so. That's especially
the reason for that is basically this. Pigment cells, the whole process of embryogenesis and building an embryo into a little animal has a pretty predictable sort of, and this has been studied in mammals, has been studied in snakes, been studied in everything. It's always broadly the same. Invertebrates. Invertebrates, you have an area called the neural tube, which is basically roughly what correlates to what will become the spinal cord, basically. That's your neural tube, and there is no spine yet in these early stage embryos. And the end of that neural tube, is basically right at the base of your neck where your head would be. That's where stuff comes out. That neural tube, this is a massive oversimplification, but using lay terms, but the end of the neural tube, basically the neural tube is like a factory that makes different cell types for the different tissues and structures of the body. They're made there, they migrate out of the end of that neural tube, and then they migrate throughout the developing embryo to the designated point where they need to be. They set up shop, they proliferate, and they form the tissues of kidneys and hearts and a lung and some scales or whatever the tissue that they need to be. They migrate out in pairs, set up shop, proliferate, and build the structures that ultimately result in an embryo. For whatever reason, and this does not have a well-known explanation, at least not I've been able to find in the literature. I mean, somebody else might chime in, who knows. It appears that pigment precursor cells called melanocytes, melanocytes are what will become the pigments of the body. They are unable to migrate out of the neural tube from that neural crest by themselves. They have to hitchhike. But you need pigment all over the entire animal or person or whatever. You need pigment all over everything. So the pigment cells, these melanocytes, will just hitchhike with other cell types that are already going to where they needed to go anyway. It's like, oh, we're making, ventral scales. Oh, I need to hitch a ride, go down there and pigment that area. It's like this sort of a thing, right? So when you have a mutation that rearranges where the paint on the snake goes, you are unwittingly rearranging whatever that pigment was hitching a ride with. And that's why you have problems sometimes. Most of the time you don't, but sometimes it gets you into trouble because you're rearranging other cells that were supposed to be there that aren't there because this rearranging of the pigment rearranged that other structure. And that gets you into trouble. This is why, I'm not a big fan of the AKC and, that sort of for a lot of reasons, but for a long time they advocated like euthanizing Dalmatians that had like solid black patches of pigment on their ears because it watered down their breed standard. But there's a bunch of idiots who didn't understand genetics and everything. What they were doing is they were selectively breeding for deaf dogs because there's a strong correlation between the amount of dark pigment on a Dalmatian's ear and the probability it's going to be deaf. Why? Because the pigment is migrating to that same area along with the structures making up the inner ear that helps in hearing. If you deny pigment in the ear zone, you are fucking up whatever that pigment was hitching a ride with. So you'll see a strong correlation between you see a Dalmatian that has like the black patches on its ears, it's almost never deaf. The ones with like almost no pigment on ears, way higher rate of deafness. Because of this phenomenon of co-migration of melanocytes with other cell types.
Very interesting. That's awesome.
But you end up with pigment cells in places you wouldn't expect there to be melanocytes, like in your brain. It's a weird system. So you could conceivably, if you're rearranging that, you could be rearranging the wiring inside your brain by changing the paint for what you think is a benign pattern mutation. You're messing with stuff that we don't understand. And it will sometimes bite you in the ass, which is what happens with these mutations. the unintended consequence and byproduct of that sort of mutation.
Hmm.
I'm trying to I'm a terrible multitasker, and I keep seeing like people asking questions at the bottom, and I'm like unable to look at you guys, have a conversation, read. I can't do it.
Yeah, that's an awesome explanation. Yeah, you definitely done it, like, because I've read about that too. It sounds like you actually are more advanced than I am, but that's with the Enigma leopard gecko. I remember I got flamed by somebody. This is a long time ago. I was probably around like my early 20s, but that's what I was like, because during the development of the neural crest, pigment cells migrate, and I noticed with Enigmas, you'd have ones with all white tails, then ones with speckled tails, and that was pigment cell migration. And I'm like, well, that makes sense why some have neurological issues that are more severe than others, because the cells migrated more properly in some and migrated less properly in others. And it's variable. So sometimes the cells are migrating to where they need to be, and then sometimes not. So it makes a lot more sense, because that's what actually I initially always thought was these neuro issues are pigment cell, or like exactly cell disrupting mutations that only disrupt the pigment cells, they're disrupting all cells. So the cells that make up the equilibrium are not going into the correct spots. But then Dave told me about the spider ball python thing. So then I was like, well, it sounds like somebody did more research. So I was like, I guess maybe I was wrong with my initial one. But what you're talking about, that it is more logical that, hey, you could see actual cell disruption. And the reason, and I don't know if you agree with this one, Nick, I think it makes a lot of sense that a lot of these, lethal homozygous are all white or almost like no pattern, or the patterns like not there, is because if the cells are completely not like migrating at all properly, and also it makes sense that the animals' pigment cells wouldn't even populate correctly, because everything is incorrect essentially. Everything's going really haywire.
Yeah, it's if you do a little research, you'll find that there is a tremendous number of what you deem lethal white mutations in other species. In mammals, there's one in chinchillas, there's some in dogs. You mentioned a horse. There's another horse that has, let's say it's a piebald horse, and the homozygous animal is an all-white.
It's the same. That's the Appaloosa. They call it an Appaloosa.
The other one, I think it's called an Overo or whatever. And the homozygous animals, their GI tract is severed, so they'll drink milk from mom, and it can't get to their intestine. It goes to their stomach, and it's not linked up, and they eventually blow it up and die horribly. Like so there's multiple this concept of lethal white mutations. You see it all over the place. Not just the spider ball type one. That's just the one we're mostly familiar with. But
I've got like 2 or 3 things. Because first off, okay, you want to talk about the lemon frost?
Oh, that's an interesting one, because that's another one where it's a high concentration of the xanthophores, and the high concentration of the pigment cells are also leading to tumor growth. So it's basically like defective pigment cells that are also turned tumor, essentially, I guess. I mean, that one I know a little bit about, Dave, but Nick actually may know more about that one, even though
I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about that mutation particularly. But are you saying that there's evidence that shows that an increase in yellow pigments as also a commensurate rise in tumor risk?
Yes. Yeah, actually, as well. Basically, if you ever look at the lemon frost, these things are like bright neon yellow. They're like fucking like vibrant, like piss nuclear yellow. They're actually pretty cool looking. But these areas, the areas with the tumors, they found that there was like an influx of like pigment cells. So it's basically this mutation sounds like it's causing an overdevelopment of certain cells, and the cells that are the pigment ones that are at least favored in this mutation are the yellow ones. And then they also, dude, they get bad. And here's the one you'll like. This one, Nick, is another fucking one where people are like, oh, I'm going to try to outbreed it and stuff. And the thing is, too, they don't get the tumors right away. It takes time for those tumors to grow and develop, which makes sense.
Are they always on the neck? What kind of cancer is it?
Look it up, Dave. I don't. But the one thing is, some people are like, oh, mine don't have tumors. But the thing is, like, these were young geckos, like, because at the time, the project was only a couple years old. It's like, well, just because your lemon frost doesn't have tumors yet doesn't mean it won't develop them. I think at some point they'll all develop them, but they're usually around the face and the neck, and sometimes they're on the body too.
A couple questions that probably will go absolutely nowhere, but just because this is like made me think of something. Like, is there a gender bias in which ones get the tumors or not? Is it equally males and females, or is it skewed one way or the other?
I think it's equal. I'm not sure because I've never had them, but with leopard geckos, as you know, primarily they're almost all females because people incubate for a higher percent of females.
Yeah, that would screw up
another thing is because they're not chromosomal linked to their sex determination. So because leopard geckos work differently.
Well, I've noticed that, I mean, in the species I work with, in the carpet python complex, you have what seems to be very, very high rates of gastrointestinal cancer, usually gastric carcinomas. And that made me think of that. But in the case of carpet pythons getting what amounts to stomach cancer at ridiculously high rates, you see a clear sort of profile of who gets it. And it's almost always like 90+% of the time, it's young adult males between like 400 and 900 grams and 2 to 5 years old. Basically, young males are just hitting their prime, coming into sexual maturity, then they develop a stomach tumor. But also in carpet pythons, we've been selectively breeding forever for more yellow pigment. So it's like when you postulated a rise in yellow pigment, albeit with a single gene that's causing it, but a link between increased amount of yellow pigment and increased cancer risk that made my mind sort of go there.
Interesting. Yeah, I like the way you think. This one made me always laugh, Dave, but he actually is asking you to pull up a super lemon frost. Oh my God, the super lemon frost, their eyelids are really thick. I mean, it's not funny to laugh at it because it's like it's a living organism, but it's like, dude, it's like some people still breed these fucking things. It's like, please quit it out. But actually now at this point, it's all overseas. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay, similar to human melanomas.
Okay.
That's all it really says. That's yeah.
Type cancer?
Yeah, skin cancer, yes.
Yeah, it's actually skin cancer, I guess, in the skin cells.
How did they even get... I don't think they'd be supers.
There's a super lemon frost. It looks fucking horrible.
I hope it's inside out.
No, it's sort of like its eyelids are like ultra thick. Dude, it looks fucking horrid.
This is like one of these topics that I think the hobby is only just now starting to really deal with. It's like the ethics of some of these things. I mean, some of these things are just not cool for the animal. I think it's like I think we should let a lot. There's a good handful of these things we should. Yeah, like that. What are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? This is the thing. Like
you wouldn't even think that's a leopard gecko. If I showed you that, Nick, would you think that's a fucking leopard gecko?
I mean, if I had a leopard gecko morph that constantly produced skin cancer, I probably would quit working with that morph. I sure wouldn't try to I wonder what a double dose of that's going to do. It's not going to do anything good. It's like, how can it possibly do good?
You want to hear something really cool, Nick?
What?
Junior almost spent $10,000 on that.
Yeah, I didn't though. I wasn't told. Just like here's like this is the big one. This is the funny one.
Enough, they probably just neglected to mention all that, right?
Yeah, I was like, isn't that funny? Oh, hey, so Nick, quick story. I invested about. We'll just go like a kind of rounded number. I throw out different numbers, but it's very close to one. I invested $70,000 into the skull face gene and Hognose. You know where this is going. I get them. Some are a little wobbly. And I'm like, all right, I know where this is going. I will breed them. I told the guy claimed that none of us have it. Anyway, the funny thing is I have seen some it's a side thing, but I did see there is a neuro issue within leopard geckos, but it's actually a polygenic trait, and it can actually be outcrossed. It's actually interesting. But anyway, I had these ones from this dude, and I do know the guys sometimes people say they've had other morphs from him that had neuro issues, and it's not really directly tied to the mutation and the mutations that shouldn't have it. So I was 99.9% sure these skull face, look at him. I was like, all right, it's a dominant trait. I'm sure it's incomplete dominant. I bet this is going to be another spider ball python kind of thing, even though these ones, they weren't severe. So I breed these skull face, and of course the babies have neuro issues. And so anyway, I go around and I'm telling everybody this, before they even invested any, because I'm I invested a ton, and I was like, yeah, they're not as bad as an Enigma leopard gecko. It's nowhere near as bad as a spider ball python, but they have a little bit of a tilt, and every now and then you'll get one that kind of goes like this a bit, and then it goes back to normal. But it's that same fucking thing with people they come out with a new gene and they fail to mention it until they've made hundreds of thousands of dollars. The lemon frost thing was actually, I don't want to talk, but the originators, they had a huge lawsuit over selling $250,000 plus worth to one individual, and then they get them and they see they're developing tumors and stuff. And I'm like, that one's even worse than the Nero issues, I'd say, by a little bit. But it's this funny thing. It's like people like, I'm going to put up my reputation and essentially be a liar because eventually people will forget about it in the sake of making money. And I could always just claim, oh, well, I'm trying to outcross them to see if they'll get better. And then when the skull-faced breeder got called out on Facebook, because some people are like, hey, I've been hearing a rumor. And I'd get kind of a little like defensive because I'm like, you're not hearing a rumor. It's all coming from me. I'm the only motherfucker that spent this much money and is running my, and I'm like talking shit about the project I spent $70,000 on. And so then he gets into the conversation, the originator, and he goes, oh yeah, I just realized it this year. I just noticed it. And I'm like, so why did it take me hours or days essentially to notice it? Notice it immediately within my offspring, but it took you 4 years of producing about 700 of them, and before you knew.
You know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
It's full of shit. Like, it's like, and the story you just told, you could probably repeat that same. There's probably 50 people that can repeat the same story about 25, 30 different things were the same thing. Oh, this morph has issues. Oh, that's really bad for business. So I'm just going to sit on that little nugget of information until I made a ton of money. When do we usually figure out that there's a problem? Not when the first guy proves it out. Not when that second tier. It's usually when it filters down a bit and somebody like, oh shit, what? Like, and then it's never the top person who points it out. It's always somebody who buys in below that person who then has to be the bearer of bad news and calls, oh, I didn't notice. Like, yeah, I can tell you stories from Python land and just anywhere else, the same shit. There's about 500,000 of them in the ball python community that are like that. In fact, is there ever been a ball python morph that had any issues where they ever just came clean initially? Because I can't think of a single one.
I don't think so.
Every single time it's lie, obscure, deny until it's undeniable, and then you admit it. Like, you got to make that money. It's like, I don't know, man. I've been doing this a long time. And it is so difficult. It takes so long to build a good reputation and so easy to just throw it away that it's just, I can't imagine throwing away my reputation to try to like hide some blemish or defect on some stupid morph. Like, I just can't even imagine doing that. It's like, it's all going to come out. People are going to notice. They're going to notice.
How about this? You have a new morph. It's really cool. It's Nero. And you sell them, but you make it a prank. So when the people find out, you can say, hey, I actually knew, but it was a prank the whole time.
Yeah. Some of these things, like the champagnes and ball pythonville, like, that's not, I've had a bunch of them, and I can honestly, I've never seen one do anything weird. I believe that they do. I don't doubt it at all. They're not, like, I've never seen a spider fail to do something goofy. Like, I've never seen one not do anything. There is a sliding scale. Like, I'll cut the champagne people some slack. I might not have noticed that. I heard that, like, and then like you look into it. Yeah, it's apparently true, but it's not that overt. But the spider totally is. I mean, that was known from day one. Like, who are we kidding here? It's like, but it was bad for business. How are you going to sell those initial animals for $18,000 a pop if you tell them, oh, guess what? They're wobbly as shit and they're head for dead. That's bad for business. So you just pretend that you don't know either of those things forever until you can't deny it anymore. It's just,
yeah.
These kind of things, I think, while it might enhance the short-term gain of this breeder or that breeder who's in that position, I think it brings the whole thing down in the long run because it just makes people skeptical of new things, because this pattern of like lying about it and hiding the truth, when anything new comes out, it makes you the first thing you think is like, is this guy full of shit? You think about that. It crosses your mind because it's happened so many times. It's like, just be honest with it. You know, it's like, you just still sold some of that stuff, even if you told people, yeah, they're a little wobbly. You know, it's like
right.
Well, that I don't, and the ethics of that, I don't know. I don't have many Jaguar carpet pythons. I've tried to like purge them from my collection entirely, but I can't seem to do it. Like, well, I have some that I've just retired. I'm not breeding you again. And then like, I'll lose an adult of whatever, and that animal has the genes I need, but it also has the one I don't want. So I had to bring them out of retirement, and then you end up accidentally every few years making like 2 or 3. You know, there's one sitting right there, just one. I hatched one, not because I really wanted to, but because I needed that animal. But yeah, I don't know. The ethics of that, I struggle with that myself. It's very easy for people to sit behind the the comfort and anonymity of their monitor and everything, and pontificate about the ethics of this and that and everything. It's like, but it's more nuanced than that, isn't it? Like in the case of a jaguar carpet and a spider ball, it does not cause this animal any pain. They don't seem to be aware that they're doing it. I wish they wouldn't do it, but they do. It doesn't seem to shorten life expectancy. It doesn't seem to have any other health effects. They just are a little bit derped out. Other than that, they eat, they grow, they breathe, they shit, they shed, they lay eggs, they live a normal life. It doesn't seem to impact them in any other important way other than it's just you just wish they wouldn't do it. Is that unethical to breed that animal? Like when you get to like scalelessness and there's things that are just, well, that is super uncool for the animal, or what's the crescent gecko morph that the super form has no nostrils? It's like, yeah, that's not
cappuccino.
Yeah, that's obviously not cool at that point. Like, what are we doing? Like, but these other things are like, is it? I don't know. Like, I don't know. I'm not going to tell the people what to do. Like in those sorts of situations, I struggle with that myself. It's like,
well, we talked about this last time that, some communities are just a little willing depending on how cool the animal looks. And we said that in the Palmetto. The reality is Junior's going to breed skullface for a while, and I'm sure your customers are still going to want them for a period of time. But in that same conversation we had last time, in 20 years from now in Hognose, people might be trying to purge the skullface out of their collection for all you know.
Well, you just kind of made a statement saying that I was going to keep continuing breeding skullface Hognose. I don't know if I'm going to continue breeding them. I mean, I produced like 30 some this year. The one thing is I have like it's very, it's mostly a pretty mild neuro issue. It does seem to be exacerbated with caramel and like frosted genes in Hognose, because the ones I have outside of that, I only have two real bad ones, and ironically, and it's coincidentally, and it's not a coincidence, I know it's tied to it, they're twins, and the twins, like if you ever hatch out like twin Hognose, or it's probably like other Colubrids too, but every time I hatch out twin Hognose, they're, pretty small, scrawny, really domed heads. They absorb, the yolk sac seems like properly enough, but they're like, as they grow too, a lot of times their heads kind of even out. They don't look like they've healthily formed all the way. And those two have really bad neuro issues. Only really nasty neuro issued ones I've produced out of like the 40 skull face babies, almost 40, happens to be the two twins. The other ones are even close to as bad as that. The twins,
that might be more easily explained just because of them being twins.
Exactly. So it's because of the twin situation. Exactly.
Just behind me, there's 9 sets of twins from 2024. There was also a set of triplets, but they didn't make it. Like, I produce twins habitually, like every year, multiple sets. I have twins from 4 different clutches. I produce twins all the time. And what you'll see if you produce a lot of twins, monozygotic twins, you'll see a lot of, you'll see a much higher rate of birth defects, problems like that. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case.
Right. So I know it's like the skull face is just exacerbated because they're twins and they're
it's not helping. It's not helping.
Yeah.
As far as what you touched on with other morphs exacerbating it, you see that in all of these things. And I don't care if any of the ball python variants that have this, and the jaguar gene and carpet pythons, I'm sure scoria boa people can tell you stories too, that you have an animal that is genetically broken. Adding more broken genes that don't work right on top of that will never make it better. It might make it worse. We'll never fix it. It might well make it, but there's a good chance it'll make it worse. And what I've seen with carpet pythons, if you have that jaguar and you pair it with basically any of the recessive mutations, it makes it worse. I have never seen an albino jag, an xanthic jag, or a granite jag that wasn't a complete mess. It makes it worse. So that's completely in line with what you would kind of expect. You see other things that don't. There are plenty of mutations when you combine with it that it doesn't. It doesn't make it better, but it just makes it doesn't make the odds any more worse. Sure. Also, I don't know. I would assume that with the Hognose versions, it'll be the same. And there's certain stressful stimuli, and you see this in mammal research on mutations that cause neurological impairment, that whenever their sort of fight or flight response kicks in and there's a stress response, that it tends to exacerbate that.
Oh, definitely.
So what you'll find is the animals that have genes that tend to be wobbly, you'll see a higher incidence of that during the breeding season, when that is the most stressful time of their lives. is the reproductive period. If you have temperature spikes, particularly high temperatures, like you can see with jaguar carpets, I mean, I'm sure it's probably the same with ball pythons and other things, but I just know a lot of people around the world with carpet pythons. You'll see people in like, Texas through Florida that have more neurojags than people who live in the northern states or in Europe, because everybody in Texas apparently has a reptile room that is a converted one-car ground level garage, and it gets blazing hot in the summer because it's Texas. And that exposure to high heat stress and everything doesn't help. It makes it worse. So I don't know. Like I said, I'm not going to cast stones at people that want to breed mutations that have minor. I'd be a hypocrite because I have done so.
Sure.
But I do sort of like, I do, and then I hate myself for doing it, and then like 3 or 4 years go by, and I need to do it again for some reason. Like, I have one snake that I held back, and I'm starting to suspect it's a jag. I didn't think it was at first, because sometimes with that one, it's not always as easy to tell. It's like I thought it was just like an exanthic super caramel, which is kind of a low rent hypo thing. And then now I'm thinking it might be an exanthic super caramel jag. I'm like, I don't want it to be a jag, but I kind of think it might be. I don't even know. Like it hasn't done anything really weird yet, but I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you on that last thought. Do you mind if I bring something up?
Yeah, no, go ahead. Jump in.
Sorry. So remember last time we were talking about how funny it was when you brought a blackhead mutation to the spider mutation, it brought you back to a normal looking ball python, but with a wobble. So when you're talking about like, the way the genes forming and all that, why do you think that still has a wobble when all the pattern essentially went back in the place it was supposed to be?
If the pigment on the pigment, you can see the pigment areas that are pigmented on the outside of the snake where those melanocytes went back to where it was supposed to be. But that doesn't necessarily, any rearranging of structures below the skin, you don't necessarily know if those went back to where they went to be. That's a weird one. It's very difficult to explain, and I'm not going to profess to have all the answers. It's also the only instance of something like that in the whole world. You can't point to a single other example of a mutation that cancels out a mutation, or mostly does. There's like nothing like that. That's a really weird, unusual situation. So it's really hard to know for sure what's going on there.
You can also be talking about like epistasis. One kind of masks the other essentially, but it doesn't mean it's masking other things that it's doing. We just call it masking because that's what we're seeing, like, phenotypically, so, but that's an interesting one, Dave. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions in here, kind of in statements. It's good. Definitely a great podcast. A lot of people are very excited talking. There's been a lot of topics brought up. There's an interesting one with Hognose we could talk about, but you're not really aware of Hognose genetics, so I don't think I'd really.
There's nothing groundbreaking in the genetics of a Hognose snake. It's all we've had the same types of mutations in everything.
Oh no,
manifest a little different, look a little different based on what it has to work with in its native species. But it's whatever you've got, there'll be an analog in some other species, and it's going to work basically the same.
Sure, yeah. I'd say there's one in Hognose that isn't in ball pythons. I'm like pretty certain of that. But yeah, there is other comparisons, but maybe not with color and pattern mutations. Because really, the only color and pattern mutations that are like widely studied are in like dogs. Some like commonly kept mammalians and rodents and livestock. Some in humans, and then but if you look at reptiles and stuff, they have a lot more alleles that contribute to pattern and colors because those are more, that's part of their DNA for survival is blending into their environment. And anyhow, so there's a lot more, color and pattern mutations because there are more alleles that code for pattern and color in reptiles. And then, you got all these different species with, variability, but there's one in Hognose snakes that's really weird. Some people think it's allelic. It's not allelic. You could almost see it kind of mimics allelism, but it definitely isn't because you can essentially, if you want me to try to explain it to you, like what the phenotype or what this gene is and how it acts. There's the caramel, hypo, and frost. Okay. And the frost is supposed to be the double visual of the caramel and the hypo. So when you breed a caramel and a hypo, people have done it and have made double hets. And anyway, so again, the frost is supposed to be the double visual, the caramel and hypo. But when you have a frost, and like I've had frost, and I started working with the project a little later, and I bred my frost and outcrossed and made a bunch of hets. And I've already knew that there's a lot of weird stuff going on. I already was aware of this before I even bred them myself, but breeding myself helps a lot. And so anyhow, these het frosts, when I breed them together, I made this year around 125 babies. I have it in a notebook. Actually, it might be in one of these notebooks. And out of the 125 babies, from what's supposed to be a double het hypocaramel to a double het hypocaramel, I produced 25% roughly frost, which is supposed to be a double visual, the rest all normal. And then when you have het caramels, and I've bred all my het caramels to other outcross het caramels, I'll get caramels, and every now and then I'll get hypos. And then sometimes a frost will pop up. And these are very phenotypically different, the hypos and caramels. There's a very big discerning difference. It's like you can tell that these are not the same gene. They changed the pigments, even on the belly, drastically. Where the pattern and the color is drastically different. But the frost and the caramel look actually identical. The frost is just way darker. And the funny thing is, the frost is supposed to be a double visual of the caramel and hypo. And the caramel and the hypo, as you can kind of guess by their names, they're both kind of forms of like T positive albinism. So, but the frost, which is supposed to be the double visual, is substantially darker. And you could explain that away and say, hey, they both affect protein pathways that affect melanin similarly, and they interact and end up causing a different disruption that ends up making a darker animal. The one thing is, though, when I bred a frost, though, to caramels, I get 100% frost. And then I've seen people breed frost to frost and sometimes get caramels. And so my one theory was frosts are just darker variations of caramels. And there's some variance to this phenotype. But the one thing that you can't really explain is the hypo just keeps popping up. No matter how much I outcross my het caramels, I bring them back. Sometimes I'll get het caramel to het caramel and I'll get all hypos, or I'll get caramels and hypos, or sometimes I'll even get frost, caramel, and hypo. Now, the one with this would be what I'm thinking is, and I conferring with my one friend who's really into genetics about this. And actually, I initially seen him talking about it. And I looked up that term. I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And you see this a lot probably in ball pythons. You actually see it with a lot of organisms. But these other alleles, they're not really mattering to the people because they're not like a color or pattern allele, but linkage. A lot of alleles are really close to each other. Or if they're really close on the same chromosome, they break off during meiosis. A lot of times alleles get inherited in packets together. So the hypo, though, no matter if it seems, once it's like with caramel, though, it's like really hard to shake it. So it looks like linkage. And then there's also indirect linkage, because when I was, reading about linkage, I was like, you know what, there has to be something like indirect linkage. So I looked it up, because the reason I thought about indirect linkage was because of the desert ghost ball python stuff. Because when desert ghost, they said those were poly, I was like, there ain't no way that's a fucking poly. And, but they're like, so I was like, I asked them, I was like, well, are these allele spikes on these genome sequencing, analysis of the desert ghost genome? It's like the spikes, are they on the same chromosome? He goes, no, they're on different chromosomes, completely different loci, different chromosomes. I was like, that's weird. And I started thinking, I'm like, well, alleles, when they get passed on, they kind of have this erratic, and here's the thing, I may be, not exactly correct on this one, but they follow an order, but the order isn't really understood by humans, from what I understand, because the allele inheritance seems to be really like erratic, but they all end up going where they're supposed to go. And so then I was like, well, if there can be linkage close, I was like, there's got to be indirect. So I looked it up, and there is indirect linkage. And that would actually explain the desert ghost, why you have 3 spikes on separate chromosomes. That's indirect linkage, because you have these common alleles that are stacking up in all these different areas, and they're always following each other around. And they're being associated with causing the DG gene, but they're not. And it's actually, that's the only thing that would make sense to me logically, is that's indirect linkage. So anyway, with the caramel and the hypo and the frost, that's what I think it is, but I don't know.
I think that the first place to start with trying to tease these things apart is Occam's razor, which is kind of where you were going with this. It's like, well, what's the simplest explanation? That's probably what it is. It's probably not the really outlandishly complicated explanations. Probably like, oh, this is just one gene that's really variable in expression, where you've given 2 names of the same thing, and that would explain everything you see and every result you've had. which is what your original hypothesis, that that's the simplest explanation. It's just one really variable thing. Hypomelanistic type genes, regardless of which type, tend to show wide variation. You don't see variation in albinism. You just don't have any black pigment. There's not light or dark albinos. They're just albinos. But hypomelanism is stopping either form of it. You're stopping a process midstream, and that leads to more variability. And so you end up lighter ones, and you end up with darker ones. And,
but that indicate like a spectrum with the caramels and the hypos. Man, it really isn't a spectrum when you see these things. I could show them to you. They're really fucking different, and you never really get an in-between. But now with the frost and the caramel, you can kind of have it does look like a bit of a spectrum to me. I mean, it is kind of mostly clean cut. There isn't really, you don't really get an overlap, but there is kind of like, I agree with you. There is kind of like, some of that with the caramel and the frost. The frost looks like a much darker caramel, but
the other problem you run into with hognose and ball pythons and any morph-based sort of reptile economy is that new mutations are considered to be valuable and highly profitable. So the process of properly scientifically proving it out and knowing exactly what you're dealing with gets rushed or not done correctly at all, because it's all about getting to the finish line as quickly as possible and getting paid. And so it leads to all sorts of mistakes. People jump the gun. They rush to the conclusion that they want to find. And then if you add on top of that another layer of what the fuck, and that is that people, most hobbyists especially, tend to do things like play musical males. Oh, I didn't see that male doing anything. I'll put in this male. They don't account for multiple paternity, parthenogenesis. They don't account for longer term sperm storage. All these things is like, you end up with, look at all the ball python people that have morphs that pop out they didn't even know was in their collection. All like, I wonder how that happened. It's like, happens all the time. And half the time in the ball python community, they just think it's a new damn morph and name it something. It's like, no, it's like, it was just floating around. Like, it's like, because nobody sells, like most people, if it's a low percentage possible het for X, Y, or Z, you just don't even mention it anymore because nobody cares. But eventually it works itself out and pops out. I have a good friend who's actually, a question at the bottom of his screen is a friend of mine, and like he's popping out orange ghost ball pythons left and right. Didn't know he had orange ghosts. He's actually like 20 of them this year. They're popping out of everything. It's like, because somewhere back in one animal was a possible het and nobody told him. That happens a lot. It makes it difficult to tease these things apart because of these other, it's not like people are trying to prove these things out. Like, okay, I'm going to go get a wild caught hognose snake here to really rigorously remove all possibility of anything else being in the mix. And
I agree with you. That's like, well, the caramel, if we're talking about that, the one thing is that it isn't a new trait. They've been out for like forever, actually. The hypo.
That actually makes it more likely that it's snuck into somewhere it wasn't known to be, though, because it's been around.
True, but the thing is, like, when I breed my het caramels back to other het caramels, I get hypos and sometimes frost from them. This would be like basically if somebody took like a past het of a past het albino, bred it to 20 animals, and every single one turned out to be het albino. Is it theoretically possible? Yes, but it'd be like going to the craps table and winning like 300 times in a row. It gets to a point where it's like you flipped a quarter 70 times, it's coming up heads. It's like, well, is this a normal quarter or is your quarter fucked up? And is it a weighted quarter or is there something like that's but the thing is, like, I'm noticing with the hypo caramel and frost. Another thing is too, they are virgin animals, and I am using only one male. I'm pretty analytical with it.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, Nick. I see like I actually, because I'm like, what you're saying is the one, because people will ask me like, hey, this person said this and that, and not to discredit other people, but I've seen it so many times where some fucking person tells me something, and then here they were actually wrong, or they just made an assumption, or they weren't keeping the best records. And so like when my dad would breed, like if he was breeding corn snake, he'd ask me questions. He'd be like, how do you think this person's corn snake project's working? And I was like, even though I know a decent amount about genetics, I'd say more than the average like reptile breeder. I was like, I don't fucking know unless I'm working with it myself, because I don't trust other people, because they'll label stuff that's polygenic as incomplete, dominant, and dominant based on the phenotype showing up very varying amount of degree in the offspring. So, but the caramel hypo frost thing, I show you pictures later. It is pretty interesting. I've never seen anything else like this. And if you look at the one thing is the frost and the caramels, they do look very similar. Other than the frosted is like has an excessive amount more of melanin, while the caramels have a way significant less. And every now and then you do get kind of like a dark caramel, but if you look at their bellies are always like wildly different. But then the hypos versus the caramels, Their pigments pretty wildly different, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting one, and I'm keeping notes about it, and we're still trying to kind of figure it out. It's either one of those two things, kind of like you mentioned, like Occam's razor. My initial thought was like these are just the same gene, and they have a very like a variation of a phenotypic expression, and that might be.
You could have two different genes that are allelic, but they express differently. They're different, but they're allelic. But if each one has a range of variation, the two ranges of variation can overlap. And you could have very easily a perfect storm of what the hell is going on here. If like the caramel and the hypo, they don't look like each other. The classic example of each is obviously discernible, but the animals on the margin of either overlap in the middle and they're allelic. You have two different things that look different most of the time, but can look similar enough to where it gets really murky when you go around in these things. I've proved out a couple of morphs myself, and one took 13 years and one took 10 years. So it takes a long time to do it the right way. Like, I don't see anybody else putting 13 years in this stuff. And sometimes it's not. One of the ones I proved out was a hypomelanistic Bredl's python mutation that is a polygenic thing, but kind of sort of not polygenic, but kind of sort of is. You can kind of look at, I'm not going to spoil anything for anybody, but everything's polygenic, guys. Sorry, everything. Everything's polygenic. You know why? Because you might have a single mutant allele that does whatever it does, but that animal, regardless of what it is, has a whole lot of other genes that are responsible for aspects of color and pattern. And though you might have this mutant gene, all those other genes still get to have their say in the final outcome. So in very real sense, everything is polygenic.
Yeah.
This is just doing its job or not doing its job, but all the rest of that stuff still gets to weigh in. And you can have things, you might have another gene that's responsible for adding the dark pigment back onto some of those animals that's not even, it just happens to be there in your group, and it's making some of these things seem darker. It might not even be caused by the mutations at play. It might be some other gene that you would consider something pretty normal and goes undetected, but in the right combination, it does crazy stuff. It's hard to really, the Bredl's gene morph I proved out, it turns out you have like a weakly expressed core hypomelanistic incomplete dominant gene that does about 50% of the total phenotype, and then another 3 or 4 genes that are kind of globbed onto that do the other 50%. But
yeah, very well said, man. This is
it's perfect. Like, it took me 13 years. I had to raise entire generations of animals to adulthood. Like, I raised a clutch of 14 Bredl's pythons for 7 years. It sucked. I didn't even want to breed them. I sent half of them to a friend of mine in Europe just so I wouldn't have to breed them and keep them anymore after they were adults to track their color progression. And then I bred them together, and I kept a clutch of like 22 offspring from them for years to see how that went. And eventually you figure it out. It's really time consuming when it's not a single, if it's something like an albino, it's so obvious. But some of this other stuff, hypomelanism can be murky. So I'm not surprised at all that, more of this stuff has a polygenic component to it than people think. It might be primarily driven by this single gene here, but don't think that something else isn't also influencing it. And a lot of times that range of variation you're seeing is actually mostly not most of the range of variation expression in these morphs is not a variable morph. It's the morph is doing the same thing in every snake. It's the other suite of genes that that animal has for all the rest of it that's variable, that's making the variation. The gene here is just, the orange ghost gene in ball pythons is doing exactly the same thing in every orange ghost ball python. But all the other genes, all the normal genes that it has, they get a weigh in. And that has an effect on the ultimate phenotype as well. So everything's kind of polygenic.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Dave.
Hold on. I don't even know if I know the answer to this. Is the green ghost any different than just your standard orange ghost and ball pythons? Like, is that actually its own line, or is that just variances of the one hypo gene?
Polly again. Nick's going to say it.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. It appears to be roughly the same thing as the others, but that was, I'm old enough to remember when people had the green ghosts and everything. I kind of tuned out a while ago, so I don't know. Is that even still around?
I had a couple that I sold just a couple years ago that, they had more of that green ghost look to them. And the customer almost immediately asked me if it was going to be okay to breed to his Orange Ghost stuff. It made me question it, but it all just came from Orange Ghost stuff originally, I'm pretty sure.
Well, that's probably just something else that's suppressing the yellows and giving it an olivey kind of color. But you can absolutely have different lines of Orange Ghost that look exactly the same that are incompatible. I mean, that happened to me a million years ago. It's like, oh, they're not even, but you couldn't tell. It's like seemingly identical animals are not always compatible.
I remember hearing about that
every once in a while.
Like imports, when they were first importing more ghost ball pythons, and some people breed 2 ghosts and you get all normals, and they're similar mutations but on different alleles.
That happened to me. I had an Orange Ghost from actually got it from the same guy. He had 2 lines of Orange Ghost. I got a group of hets from one line, a visual, and I had to ultimately bred to themselves. I had to eventually separate these things, raise up, animals from each, and then I got ghosts on both sides, but they were not compatible, which was super inconvenient.
The Polygenics would explain though, Dave, like the ghosts, would you'd have the green ones, like a green ghost would most likely probably be a darker looking individual ball python with like some, like you ever look at some normals, they kind of have that more olivey color. And then the orange ones are probably going to be a little prettier, have a little more gold tones and stuff like that. Cause like that's like ball python people, Nick, like a lot of them, you talking about polygenics, like, I'm not gonna say all ball python people, I say newer ones, they're aware of mutations, but they're not really aware of polygenics. And the funny thing is, it's like all ball python breeders are like passively, selectively line breeding and working on polygenics. I mean, you're always working on polygenics, whether you are or you aren't, but they're actively, selectively line breeding polygenics. Because if you're keeping your best entries and your best pastels, like you're saying, you're not making, oh, I got a more pastel mutation, this is a better mutate. No, if you look at a really pretty pastel or an entry and you stripped away that mutant, it'd be a really pretty ball python that supports and complements that gene. So like the green ghost, Dave, I bet those ones would be like a darker kind of our olivey colored animal. And then the orange ones are going to be that little more like tangerine kind of looking babies.
By any chance would those green ghosts have possibly been het for Exanthic?
That is an interesting question. Here's the thing. They're just like corn snakes, man. Ball pythons are het for everything now. They very well could have been. I think it's unlikely, but nothing, I wouldn't know. Like, I wouldn't know for sure with that lineage. Like, I've never really had them run.
That is one of the other, like, super misunderstood things is, like, nothing is Exanthic. There are no Exanthics. There are no Aneries either. All these things are incomplete dominant hypoxanthic. It's not recessive. It's not exanthic. We call it exanthic. We pretend it's recessive. It isn't either of those things. It's like, it's always incomplete dominant hypoxanthism because it absolutely reduces the amount of yellow pigment in the heterozygous state. And it never eliminates it completely in the homozygous state. It's why every snow of everything that's ever been made looks like shit when it's an adult. Where'd all that yellow in your snowball come from? It was always there because it didn't remove all the yellow. Ergo, it's not exanthic. It's hypoxanthism. That's why there's that remainder of yellow. What it is, it's always an incomplete dominant mutation that removes about 20-25% of the yellow pigment initially, and then in its heterozygous state, and then about 80% of it in the homozygous state. But that 20% what's left when it's an albino at the same time is really obvious. That's why every snow boa, every snow corn, they're never pure white, are they? And the aneries are just the same. It's the same thing. We just call it anery because we live in this delusion where snakes have a bunch of red pigment or something. And it's all the same thing. The red and the yellow are functionally the same. So it's all the same.
Hey, Nick, I would blame geneticists. Geneticists kind of put those labels on them, I feel like. I mean, you could say the reptile hobby, they adopted those terms, but, the geneticists, like, I was talking to, I think, Dave and other people about, like there was, like, terms like codominant, incomplete dominant. Like, codominant, that definition, like, bothers me because it's such a precise definition based on the phenotypic, like, expression. It's like, why is there even that term? Well, you're really just explaining that it's too, and it's also dominant. It's two different dominant.
A lot of this sort of misunderstandings and nonsense comes from one particular source that I won't endlessly beat up on, but that one, I mean, even I got to let it slide. If you look up read the definition of codominance and the definition of incomplete dominance, it is legitimately confusing. That is an easy mistake to make. And that got stuck and was misinterpreted. That's very understandable how that happened. But the fact of the matter is, codominance doesn't even describe a mode of inheritance at all.
No, it's dumb. It's the dumbest shit ever. I hate codominance.
Like, codominance is like describes the relationship between two genes. Incomplete dominance describes the inherent mode of inheritance of those genes. It's like it was never a thing, but the definitions are confusingly similar, and that's an easy mistake to make. But with the xanthic and the anery, it's like snakes don't have fully differentiated yellow and red pigment. It's a sliding scale of the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, I produce xanthic Papuan carpets. Papuan carpets are bright red babies. They look like a maraschino cherry. They are that red, right? They are ridiculously red right out of the egg. But an xanthic Papuan carpet should still be super red, right? Because it's only removing the yellow pigment, right? Not the red pigment should be intact. But no, it's silver. Why is that? Oh, because it's the same freaking thing. What we see as red, what we see as yellow can be viewed as the same thing. Ergo, I made the mistake of getting on a boa forum and telling those guys there's no such thing as an anery boa, and that was a mistake. They will come. They will come for you in the night if you do that. If you tell them that, it's like it's true. It's all the same thing. It's like we tend to call these things. Oh, it's an anery corn. It's an xanthic corn. It's all the same thing, and it's always incomplete dominant. If you look at the pastel ball that was het for xanthic, it kind of really, you can notice it at a baseline level with like a normal that just het for xanthic and ball pythons. It's not, because they're still within the normal range of variation. So it doesn't jump out at you. It's something like a pastel that has an increased amount of yellow, and then you knock it back 25%. It becomes obvious. You can totally tell.
In boa constrictors, the black-eyed anery is what they call the... So have you seen the blizzards? Because you're right. When you breed what is considered the type 1 anery in boas to albino, you get an animal that shows pattern through in the snows. With the black-eyed anery stuff, when you breed that, you get a blizzard, a completely patternless animal, more of a ruby eye. For what I can remember in the adults, I'm sure there is some yellow pigment that starts coming through, but I don't think there's so much pattern.
It's probably... I'm sure if you put it under a black light, the pattern's probably there. It's probably very hard, almost hard to detect visually. But if you look at xanthic mutations, again, there's always a ball python, isn't there? If you look at the different lineages of xanthic ball pythons, there's a bunch. It turns out in that sort of pigment synthesis pathway that makes that yellow pigment, there's a bunch of different links in that chain you can break and end up with some kind of xanthic looking snake. So that's how you end up with. You ever notice you never find like incompatible types of albinism, but you find incompatible types of xanthism? Because to have an animal that has no black pigment whatsoever, there's only one place you can break it, and they're all compatible. But xanthic, you can break several different places in that series of events and end up with some sort of xanthic animal. And so some are going to be better than others. Some are going to be more complete, a larger reduction. Even if not a complete elimination, some are going to get a lot more of it with a much smaller remainder of yellow that's left over. Go less pigment, less pattern, and some are going to let a lot more come through. So that's
I agree, but boa constrictors, sharp albino, call albino for the negatives.
What?
Oh, for boa constrictors, you have the sharp albino line and the call albino line. They're both T negatives, and they both hit the market at the same time, and they're incompatible.
Because the sharp is a T positive.
I agree, and Junior said that a long time ago too.
It's compatible with the T positives, and people were like, "I can't believe the sharp." Was like, "Really? Did you look at them? The reason why you wanted them is because they have that deep, rich color, and they look really like, yeah, it's like they're a very light T positive, not a very heavily pigmented, saturated T negative." So
I think the one thing you could explain too is like if you look at like an albino ball python, T neg, and it's allelic with candies, which are a T pos. But it's mutants of the same allele. One mutant is obliterating, or like let's say just like completely severing the ability to synthesize thymidase, and the other one is inhibiting it in a similar fashion, but it's allowing some of it through because they're alleles of the same, they're mutants of the same allele on the same loci. The candy.
This is one of those things where I include myself in this, but the hobby collectively needs to be have a little more humility. In that we throw around terms like we know these things to be true.
Yeah.
The tyrosine positive albino. You know where that comes from? Some fish research in the 1970s. You know how many of these snakes have been tested to see if they have or don't have tyrosinase? None. We are just making that assumption. But and it's a well-founded assumption. But we don't know that they're T positive or T negative. We're just making that assumption based on some research originally done in fish in the 1970s. Like we're just like looking. We categorize that looks like what we think a T positive albino is. It must have some amount of tyrosinase, but this has not been rigorously tested in any way. So we should probably, I don't know, like the older I get, it's better to not speak in absolutes, I guess. We don't.
Yeah, I like that.
And I call these things T positive. I do that too, but it's like, we don't really know that with any confidence. We are assuming that based on some research from some fish 40 years ago.
Sure. I mean, you even see it in the birds, though. Like, they'll have, and then if you look up like albinos, there's like 7 types of albinos. There's a few really rare types, and they're like the OCA1, OCA2. And then there's ones they show I need to do a little more research in that one.
Albinism or whatever.
Yeah. So but the thing is, like, if you look at an albino ball python, I mean, you could see that, this thing isn't visibly expressing any melanin that we can see. But you could say it could possibly be producing it at 0.01%. We just can't really identify it ourselves because we're limited in our capacity. So
supposed to completely eliminate it, that it looks like it is eliminated, but there actually is
there's actually some there, or it's another mutation that's shutting off its ability for melanin protein pathways, and then the other one is doing something similar. But the funny thing is, if you do the candy and the toffee together and you breed them, you do get like an in-between. And, the one, it does appear to be T negative, it appears, and the other one appears to be T positive. And I got to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back.
That's fine. He's got to get headphones for this.
I remember the dawn of the ball python thing. And the concept that what we call a T negative albino, what if it's just a T positive with like 1% left, and it's just not enough to visually see with our naked eyes? Back in those early days, people would produce and sell what they called high contrast albinos. But what they were doing, they're just breeding the darkest normal ball pythons they possibly could in their albino to increase the amount of melanin. Then when you strip that away in the albino, you would end up with a bright orange albino, and it would have the faintest lavender hue to the white. It was really pretty. It's like, it makes you wonder, like, is there just some 0.5% left?
Too, when you're talking like line breeding, like focusing on certain essentially normals breeding to your albinos to maybe make a higher contrast animal. That's one thing that doesn't really happen in ball pythons. You don't really hear about breeding like that. Not really much thought is put into that, is the way it is. I mean, I've never seen anybody put thought into it.
They did back in the day, but that was when you had like 2 more. I remember when there was albino balls, and that was it. And then there had been xanthics over the years, and then orange ghosts, and then you had like this couple of different genes, and a lot more selective breeding was done then. But then it gets to the point where you have so much, no one's got the attention span to also selectively breed. There's 50,000 things. It's all just combining things and not trying to refine any one thing. It's trying to stack more things into a thing instead of trying to really work with a thing and make it better.
No, I'm not sure if we talked about this in the last podcast, but are you familiar with the black xanthics and ball pythons from Tracy Barker?
Yes, I'm not. I was just talking to Ryan about that recently. I wonder whatever happened to that project.
So the project never really went anywhere, but what happened is that people were getting these super dark animals and breeding them and getting fairly normal looking xanthics. Don Patterson was the guy who got into that project pretty early also, and he was showing me his offspring pictures, and they looked like a standard xanthic. The question was, I think eventually we found out they were just TSK line, like they're compatible. They're the same thing after doing testing. But some of them had variables where you get these darker animals, and I don't know if you remember the Stormtrooper. It was
named after Star Wars, though. So.
Yeah, it was like an increased melanin in this animal for an xanthic that got better over time, and John Day called it the Stormtrooper. I don't think he was ever able to reproduce that animal, but that animal made SK xanthic stuff sell like fucking crazy for at least 5 years. I'll look up the picture. You guys talk.
I'd say, Nick, I kind of just jumped in. Does black xanthic stuff and it being basically it's the same as a TSK xanthic? Is that right? The black.
Yeah, they're the exact same thing. Yeah, it's the exact same thing.
Most likely a polygenic, variation. Like polygenes are interacting with it, making it darker, and then therefore you think you got a different one. Like, I mean, you can do that with like anything if you selectively line breed anything long enough. I mean, if you took like, let's say, an Enchi ball pythons and you put them in a timeline where somebody's able to selectively line breed them to say like real dark granity ball pythons or really reduced high gold ball pythons for about 30 years, and they came back with them, you could pass it off as a new, probably like, oh yeah, it looks like a different type of Enchi, Yeah, that one's cool. But I feel like that's like one of those maybe like hormonal, like autogenic, like reaction, like, developments, like where you get this weird calicoing kind of like effect. Because like those blue ball pythons people get all the every now and then, where they turn like dark grayish blue.
It was a progression
like that. Oh god, I gotta drink more water. I'm taking antibiotics right now, man. This shit's making me drink all day.
No, you're good. Yeah. So I agree with that. I've lost all train of thought. By the way, I'm sorry. I've been up for like 14 hours. I painted an entire building today. I feel like shit. Every once in a while, my brain's going to stop working. Well, I'm working on the new shop. I was doing the floors and the walls today.
Yeah, black Xanthic might have linkage. It is possible to have linkage with a poly trait that interacts with it. But you could also break that link possibly too.
Well, desert ball python, the one that had the reproductive issues. Did you ever follow that one much? That was around your time being pretty heavy in ball pythons, right?
Yeah, that was quite the. I mean, they did a better job managing the expectations of that than a lot. It wasn't all a bunch of lies. It was like, well, this isn't looking good, guys. It's like, just, and eventually it just is what it is. That's a weird one-off. I mean, what I think people lose sight of is they think that the morph game is like this all no harm, no foul, and it's totally not. Like, the fact that morphs exist that have problems and kill the snake or are unhealthy or have defects, it is not surprising at all. It should be shocking that there are so many that most of them don't. It's amazing to me how many morphs there are that have no baggage whatsoever. That there are a good handful that do it's surprisingly few that are problematic, really. Like, these, like, what is a morph? It is a gene that doesn't work right. It's a broken gene that doesn't do any of its various jobs, since all these genes do more than one job typically, including very seemingly unconnected things. Well, look at like a cinnamon ball python. Oh, the homozygous form is completely black and has spinal kinking, and it fucks its skull development up. What does the shape of the skull and your spine have to do with the pigment? Why are those things linked? Why does the super zebra jungle carpet python? Oh, it's patternless. And it has a super high rate of tail tip, like a 95% rate of tail maladies, tail tip deformities, kinks, or shortened tails. What is their tail forming of your tip of your tail to do with their absence of pattern on your back? So when a mutation happens and it doesn't do its color and pattern job, it's not doing any of the other jobs it has correctly either. And sometimes it causes problems. So we should be thankful that so many of them are harmless, but we shouldn't be surprised. The reproductive problems with the desert, that was a cool morph. Man, it would have had a lot of potential in today's market if that would have been viable, because it did some crazy, and back in those days there was way less to combine it with, and it didn't get that far. You never got to see what it would be able to do, but I would suspect based on early results, it probably would have had a lot of potential, but females dropping dead when you try to breed them doesn't really bode well for,
Yeah, I think Justin Quebeca used to do the Ball Street Journal. I don't know if you remember that. And I remember he had a desert female, and I think he waited till like 6 or 8 years to try breeding it to see if maybe if you waited longer it'd be okay. And in the end, had to take it to a vet. They had to remove the eggs from the animal to keep it alive, so on and so forth. He showed the whole surgery on there. And that was kind of like, I think at the end of his article, it was like, so I'm done now. I give up. Like, that was kind of it.
It's probably not like what will ultimately befall the scaleless ball pythons or some of these other things. It's like, they can't all be winners. You should rejoice in the fact that 99% of them are winners, though. Like, if there's 1%, that's a shockingly high rate of non-problematic things that you can mix and match without really any problems or anything. It's considering the sheer number of them, it is shocking to me that there are only this small number that have any issues at all.
No, you're right. Junior?
Actually, real early, I didn't get to it. Trinity asked Did you write have you written a book, Nick, or are you co-writers with a book? If it sounds like
another book, or have I written books?
Have you written books?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So Trinity, if you're still there, so what books have you wrote, and what were they on?
The first one was The Complete Carpet Pythons, like a 350-page book on carpet pythons. I think we published that in 2011. Then we did an Antaresia book 2 years later, covering that entire genus. And then it's been, couple 3 years now. We put out the second edition of the Carpet Python book, which is not a second edition in the traditional sense, where most time a second edition of a book, you spruce it up a little bit, put a few new pictures, a new cover, you add a bonus chapter on something, and you resell the same book. We rewrote the entire book. Like, there's not a single paragraph that wasn't rewritten, and we added 300 pages. So the second edition is 650 pages and changed every single picture. So every image is different, all the text is different, and it's 650 pages.
You should do a Nero edition where you don't change it. You should just like fuck up the book, and it's exactly the same, and then people pay for it and they get nothing basically.
Because there was a 10-year gap between the first and second edition, you learn a lot more in 10 years.
Yeah.
Hopefully learn some stuff. There'd been a fair bit of research done, molecular research, and then through my own sort of career connections and whatnot, I have some good friends who are geneticists and whatnot, so I had access to having some stuff done for the book, so really able to really do something really in depth. Currently, very slowly, I got to get back on track with it. It's very difficult for me to write when eggs are hatching and babies, because all these things behind me, none of them want to eat rodents. Like, when you hatch 300 snakes that all are mammal eaters, that's not that big a deal. If you hatch 300 snakes that all want geckos or lizards that they are never going to get, it's a lot of work. So I don't generally have time. I'm just starting to head into my season where I can actually sit down and write some more. But we have been working on another book covering the Aspergilles genus. That'll be a little different. There's 4 authors. I'm just one author of 4, so I don't have quite as much responsibility on that one. And then I've got another book that's kind of been slowly brewing in the background. That'll kind of be my magnum opus. That'll hopefully I live long enough to finish it. And that'll be something truly large, I guess. Very, very ambitious. But yeah,
that was kind of sad.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Well, then we'll talk. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Antaresia, that's the spotted children's, Stimson's, the anthill.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. All those guys. There's a few more than that, but it's a little. You could argue about how many species there are, probably. Well, I would argue about how many species there are, but
okay. What other Antaresia are there?
You have Eastern and Western Stimsons, which were separate subspecies. Children's pythons, spotted pythons, pygmy pythons. Then a paper came out that split spotted pythons into 2 different subspecies, which is what that aspect of the paper is very well founded. The Cape York ones are very, very different. And that aligns with everything we know about the biogeography of the region and the speciation patterns you see in other species that share that same distribution. But that same author decided that Stimson's pythons were all the same as children's pythons. So, and then he made the New Guinea spotted pythons, which are relatively recently found, a full species. But to do that, his own paper I have a lot of criticisms of that paper. If you look at his molecular phylogeny in the paper, it clearly shows the Western Stimson's pythons are very different. It clearly shows them way over here. But nope, those are just children's pythons. But then once the split hairs and name the New Guinea spotted pythons as a full species, which makes no sense biogeographically, there is nothing that shows that pattern. In every time you have a species that's on both sides of the Torres Strait, so basically Cape York Peninsula, Australia, and southern New Guinea, every single solitary time, it's the same species on both sides. There's no examples. The water pythons, same. The chondros, same. The scrub pythons, same. Like the frilled dragons, same. But somehow the spotted python is a full species different. It's like they all got there the same exact way at the same time. But for some reason, the pattern that you see in literally everything, in the birds, in the geckos, in the skinks, in all the other pythons, in the monitors, in everything else, you see the same exact pattern. But the spotted python, just blow all that up. New species. So I'm extremely dubious. Also, the spotted pythons at the very, very tip of the Cape York Peninsula in an area called the Lockerbie Scrub look identical to the ones in New Guinea, which is only 22 miles away. It's like, and you could have walked from the Lockerbie Scrub in Australia to southern New Guinea like 7,000 years ago. You could have walked it without getting your feet wet. It's only that. So, but somehow these are different species. I don't buy that. And the data in that paper is not convincing to me at all that the Stimsons are the same thing as a children's python. I don't buy it. So
they don't look the same to me. I always thought Stimsons got a lot bigger too, but man, I don't really know.
They don't. They're all just, you know, size doesn't make much difference with most of that stuff. But I'm like, that brings up a larger point, not just my grievances with that particular paper and that author's work more generally, is that people tend to have this mistaken belief in the hobby that, well, it's official now, children's pythons and Stimsons are the same thing. And it's like, no, it's not. That's not at all how science works. All a paper, people tend to think, lay people tend to think, oh, some scientists said this in a paper, so that's the thing now. It's like, no, it's like you have any individual reader, whether an academic or a lay person, you can take that information and do anything you want with it. You can accept it. You can, you know, wipe your ass with it if you want. It doesn't matter. There's no such thing as official taxonomy at all. Full stop. There is not now, nor will there ever be a uniform, this is what every species is and everybody agrees. That all the paper says is that in the opinion of this group of authors at this point on this day, we think this is what the evidence shows. And anybody else can say, bullshit, I don't believe that. I don't accept that. You can write another paper that says something totally different. It's not this. There is no official word on anything. You can
it's like it goes back
deny or refute anything.
Yeah,
so
don't speak in absolute.
Don't accept that paper.
Like you said, I agree with that one. Oh, sorry.
I accept the portions of it that are well-founded and show clear correlation with other speciation patterns seen in related species that share that distribution, because that on the Cape York, and I breed Cape York spotteds and normal spotteds, and they are way different. It's obvious to me. And the breakpoint between the spotted python subspecies in that paper is exactly the same point where you see the genetic disjunction in carpet pythons. It's exactly the same place, which is also the same place where you see the disjunction in a couple of birds, a couple of ground skinks. You see this a breakpoint where it generally keeps the stuff below and the stuff above. And you see it across a bunch of stuff. And sure enough, the spotted pythons are bigger, more robust. They look different. They lay more eggs. They eat rodents more readily because they're different. That totally checks. But the stuff in New Guinea doesn't really check. And the stuff with synonymizing other stuff, I don't know. I don't buy it. At least I think you need to make a better case than that paper did to convince me. So the only takeaway is that there's no such thing as the official taxonomy of anything.
They're always changing it. It leads me to this one too. It's like Komodo dragons. Remember, that was actually published, and it would actually be written in books and, you know, put on, like, you know, documentaries that they have bacteria that subdues their prey, and the bacteria infects them. And here it was venom the whole time. They were actually venom.
It's a sexy hypothesis, but nope, it's actually venom.
Right. It's a hypothesis.
If you want to, like, there's no, in all of like reptile taxonomy, there is no greater crime than the varanid people. In what you'll find, and it's kind of disheartening, what you'll find, like in every like little subgroup of like herpetology, there's like a little group of people that write all the papers on that stuff. So like almost all the Python papers, there's like the same names you see popping up most every time. And on the monitors, it's a small group of people that write all the monitor papers. So their opinion, and it is only their opinion, tends to hold sway. To me, the idea that every monitor that's ever existed is in the same genus is so goddamn ridiculous. It's laughable. It is fucking laughable. That a Storrs monitor that is the size, that is not much bigger than a Carolina anole, is in the same genus as an extinct monitor that was 15 feet long and venomous is an insanity to me. But nope, it's all Varanidae. It's like, what? Like, you have a clade of Varanids with 3 species, the extinct Megalania, Komodo dragons, and crocodile monitors that are all giant monitors that are fucking venomous. And that even being giant venomous monitors wasn't enough to get you your own genus. Are you telling me that all the genus is a tool for recognizing groups within a family?
Sure.
And if you look at like the tree monitor group, you've got like 7 of them, and they're all a genus is supposed to be. It's a group of species that are more closely related to each other than any of them are to anything else. That's what it is. Are you telling me the tree monitors aren't a genus? They all have exactly the same body structures, same prehensile. They're all super closely related to each other, and they're all very diverged from everything else. That is the textbook's example of what a genus is. Nope, they're all in Varanidae. As if like these are not different enough to have their own genus. You have probably 8 or 9 genuses. Like you tell me the black throat, white throat, savanna monitor, all that group of African monitors is it not a different group than the water monitor complex or the I mean, how many freaking mangrove monitors are there now? You have a whole group of them that are all way more closely related to each other than they are to anything else. There's a group of water monitors. There's the tree monitors. A lot of the dwarf monitors. There's a bunch of different groups that should be different genera of monitors. And the fact that they're all just in Varanidae is just an absolute absurdity. It is. I don't even know how this even flies. Why am I the only one always screaming about this? It's ridiculous. It is fucking ridiculous.
I think that
would be like saying every primate living and extinct throughout all of Earth's history is in the genus Homo with us. That's how absurd that is. The divergences in monitors are fucking old, ancient lineages. You're talking about animals that diverge 20, 30, 40 million years from each other. Nope, that's not far enough back to be a different genus. Are you kidding me? Are you absolutely kidding me? Like, it's insane. We are less than 0.2% different from being a goddamn chimpanzee. And last I checked, we're in Homo and they're in the genus Pan. So but these monitors need to, there's no amount of differentiation that would give them, split them up into more than one genus. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. This lack of like any uniform standard for what constitutes a species. Like the extreme, like why are we lumping like, we don't follow our own, there is no rules. Like look at how many hominid species there are, like, and in the fossil record, they're based on almost no genetic difference at all. And then but somehow these pythons need to be like 5 or 8% different from each other to be separate species. Like you are far less than 5% different from an orangutan, which you are clearly not an orangutan, are you? Like, it's like, this is insane. Why do we have this ridiculously low threshold for some species and this impossibly high standard for speciation in other species? You guys, taxonomy is farcical at times. There are frog species and bird species that are classified as separate, distinct species based entirely on the sounds that they make. Oh, this bird over in this valley over here, it sings a different call. A mating call is different, ergo it's a different species. The same damn bird. It's like, or this frog makes a different sound, and that's a different species. It's like, that's all it takes for those groups. But a damn python needs to be this ridiculous level of genetic distinction to be considered a species. But humans, virtually nothing. You know, it's like this unequal treatment of this just leads to the whole notion being kind of, I don't know, it's hard to take it seriously. And I'm a person who follows it diligently and has kind of been involved in a little bit of this in the last 5 or 6 years. And it's just like, yeah, it's like this lack of uniformity in any standard at all.
Now, is there a list of monitor people that you hate that we can have?
I don't hate anybody. I just think that their views are dumb. I just think that that's just like a ridiculous. No, and then they always say like, well, they've divided Varanidae up into a bunch of subgenuses. It's like nobody uses subgenuses, and most cladistic taxonomists don't even recognize the subgenus as a taxonomic rank. So
isn't a subgenus like a subfamily?
Yeah, it's like nobody cares about that. Like nobody. It's like these are completely different things. I do think that taxonomically, while you agree or disagree, over time, we get closer and closer to having things right. Like if you look back 100 years, it was all wrong. You look back 50 years, it was better than 100 years ago, still a bunch wrong. If you look at it now, it's getting pretty close to being right in understanding the relationships between these things, but it still isn't right. But every revision, every paper, I think the trend line is you get closer to a genuine understanding of what's what and how it relates to each other. You're moving in the right direction, but it's haphazard. And there's a lot of just like obvious no-brainers that don't ever happen. But I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. I guess it's most academics, they need to find a way to get paid to do research.
Yeah,
and
I believe that one.
That it is a lot easier to get a grant proposal through and get funding to study a thing. If there is a commercial application for research, a potential payday for somebody that might want to fund some research, that's a lot easier. Stuff like the relationships of some scrub pythons and some islands off the Bird's Tail Peninsula of PNG that most people didn't know existed, there's no way to monetize that. There's not a big outpouring of like grant money to study that kind of stuff. So the kind of like the pure sort of just intellectual mental masturbation kind of stuff, I just want to know the answer to this. It's like there's not a lot of funding for that. So that stuff doesn't get, there's not a lot of emphasis on it because it's hard to, you know, if you look at papers on most papers done on Australian pythons, they'll usually be, there might be some great data in there. And then there'll be like that section at the end, which is how they got the funding, where it's like trying to like find some way to use this new information that they've uncovered to stop wildlife trafficking. It's like, because that was how you got the government grant to study it. You know what I mean? It's that kind of a thing. And it's hard for some of this, for some of these obscure things that live in obscure places. There's just not the money and for people to do the work. Like I don't know if I would say I'm fortunate, but the research that I'm involved in, it's like, yeah, we're just paying for it ourselves because we just want to know. I want to know so bad, I'll cough up out of my own pocket to pay for it. That's largely what, you know, what's happening because I just want to know. But most of the time that's not, you don't get a lot of passion projects, I guess, in academia. It's
yeah, that makes
so
sense.
It does sort of, I think a lot of academics would be studying some pretty different stuff if they were following, if they got to study what they were really interested and not what they needed to be studying, you know?
They should do that, an interest grant. Now, the Veridid people, are they doing like any like DNA analysis? Like, how do they come up with this stuff? Do they take DNA from these guys and like
from what now?
The Veridid, like, you know, the monitor people, wouldn't they like have DNA from all these different species and be able to?
I don't
like,
read their papers infuriate me, so I quit reading them a long time ago. But
okay.
I would assume they're using the same sort of molecular tools that are kind of what's become, you know, quite an industry standard these days, and that's great stuff.
Why the fuck aren't they reading them? Shouldn't there be some
problem though? Is
this
is
big
that
disparity?
The problem is the ICZN, which is the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, is a fucking like just it's an institution that
it's bureaucracy.
Needs to get its shit together and join the current millennium because it's still stuck. You're basically trying to. The rules of taxonomy have not changed in any measurable way in like over 230 years since Carl Linnaeus invented binomial nomenclature. And the rules are so arcane and so vague. There is no uniform standard at all. You know what the standard for what constitutes a species is? Whatever in the hell you feel like when you're writing the paper, that's the standard because there isn't one. How much weight do you give genetic distinction? How much genetic difference does there need to be? Fuck only knows. However much you feel like in the opinion of the person writing the paper, there is zero standard. There is zero guidance. There is literally nothing. You know what you have to do to classify a species? The rules still are built for a system of communication that was before mass media and the internet and computers and anything. It's literally, you have to write up on a piece of paper. You write up what your new species is and how it's different, how you can tell it apart from its most closely related species. Then you have to print up a certain number of copies that need to be distributed with a certain radius of where you live, because that was the technology in the late 1700s. And that's it. There is no instruction to give into what you might consider be to make any difference. It's like so there's no measure, like if there's no rule like 2% genetic distinction is a different species. Well, that would be super useful if that was something, anything. There's nothing. So we split things like, you know, well, you guys and me, we're all hybrids. None of us are there's no such thing as a pure Homo sapiens left on Earth. We're all hybrids. We're hybrids of the species that is so genetically similar. Nobody argues that Homo neanderthalensis was a separate species. Nobody argues that they're Homo sapiens. Everybody agrees generally that they are their own distinct species that is this different. That it's like this infinitesimally small difference at the molecular level. That's it. but that's enough for us. Nobody questions it, but Varanids apparently need to be just like orders of magnitude more than that to be anything at all. It's just nuts. Like they split species of Varanids on a hair's breadth of difference, but at the genus, nope, it's all the same genus. Like that's nuts. That's the only thing we do that. Why do we do that? Why is that way? Because there's no rules. And the opinion of the people who write all those papers, that's what they think it should be. So that's what gets published. And they're just, I think most people would be aghast to realize how just utter unorganized, and there's just no structure to taxonomy at all. None.
It makes
like
sense.
Whatever you feel like, however different you want it to be, doesn't matter. If you have a very low threshold, you might get some blowback from other people that think it should have been more, but it doesn't even matter. Like I read one paper, it's 20 years ago now, and they were just using mitochondrial DNA because that was about all you could get done back 20, 25 years ago. And it was analyzing carpet pythons. And it decided that these carpet pythons needed to be 5% sequence diversion from each other to be different species. I'm like, the fuck? 5%? 5%? If you took 5% as your benchmark, you would have one cat. Your house cat, your bobcat, your lions, you'd have a cat. You'd have an elephant because they're all within that. You'd have an ape because all apes would be the same species. All of them. All the great apes would be Homo sapiens, apparently. You think, well, that's fucking ridiculous. But that was they came up with. They decided that the inland carpet pythons, one of my favorite species, the yellow and pink labels behind me right there, or this year's babies, that they were almost significant because they were 4.9% different. And that was just almost significant. The implication being like, yeah, I can't even tell these things apart. They're like, what? Are you crazy? They're small. They're reproductively isolated on the other side of a mountain range. They're genetically off the charts different. Their entire mating system is different in that the females are larger than males who don't combat. Their breeding season is a different time of year. Every single possible thing you could possibly look at to show you that something is different, they're different. And they're 4.9%. Nope, not enough, apparently. It's insane. It's insane. It's like, it's just this no rhyme or reason to it. It's like, well, that's what we think. So that's what we're publishing. And that's how the whole system works. So that's my angry old man rant about taxonomy. So I guess.
That's fair.
So it sounds like you're pro-hybrid?
What?
You're pro-hybrid?
What?
I said you're pro-hybrid?
No, I'm not as it pertains to these animals I have, but that's more my personal interest. To me, it loses interest when it's a hybrid. What makes an inland carpet really awesome is all that evolutionary history that went into making that animal the way it is, how it is, and where it is. That end animal where it exists is the end product of a tremendously long, complicated story that arrived at this animal being in this place at this time. And when you just start mixing and matching and hybridizing things because it makes some pretty colors, you just destroyed all of it. All the things to me that make these things interesting are obliterated when you start hybridizing them for the sake of just novelty. And it's just not worth it. And in the species I work with, for the most part, you can't get new bloodlines. The bloodlines we have, we're lucky we have what we have. We're surely not getting any new bloodlines. So if you act a fool with what you have and hybridize them all for the sake of novelty, what's the next generation of herbers going to have? A bunch of hybrid garbage. You think they're going to be happy with that? You think they're going to be, man, I'm sure glad those carpet guys before me gave us all these like hybrid morph combos. I'm sure glad they did that. They're not going to be doing that. They're going to be cursing your name because they'll never be able to find a pure inland carpet because you fucked it off and made that decision for them. You robbed the next generation or two of hobbyists the ability to even work with some of this stuff because you pursued short-sighted, stupid stuff. And that's so I don't do that. I'm like, I take this seriously. I breed things I'm not even that into because I feel like if I don't do it, no one's going to do it. And I've got ample evidence to suggest that's exactly the case because there are I can think of 2 entire bloodlines of carpet python that I stopped working with. They were not rare at the time. I had produced numbers of them. I stopped working with them, moved on to other things, and they are completely extinct. They died out. They no longer exist as a discrete entity in the hobby at all. They just got bred into other stuff, put into the sausage maker, and now you can't find them. They don't exist because I, as an individual, was apparently the only body bothering to keep it going. And I see right now one that cusp of losing another one. There's a line of Brettles pythons from the UK that I'm the only one that's ever produced. I produced 3 entire clutches of them. They don't lay small clutches. You're talking like I've probably produced 40 individuals, like 40 animals. And not to this day, not one single person has ever made a clutch of them. One guy made a couple clutches breeding them to another bloodline, but breeding this bloodline as a distinct entity, there hasn't been a single egg hatched in 6 years because I haven't hatched any. And none of the people I did bothered to keep it going at all. None. So you might lose a whole bloodline just because I dropped the ball, as if it's like, so I don't know. I could do as much as I can as an individual, but there needs to be, I think we need more of a collective responsibility sort of thing going. It's like, God damn, like we only have all this awesome stuff at our disposal because people kept it going. And if we're going to be the generation that drops the ball and doesn't care anymore, what's going to be 20 years from now? What's the hobby going to look like? A bunch of mixed up mutt retics and no pure ones anymore. A bunch of mixed up mutt carpets and mixed up boa constrictors and a bunch of this stuff. It's like, is that really a good thing? Because I don't think it is.
That's something Vin talks about is, his passion for working with the bows that he does. To him, there's not going to be another Vin. Like, there's not going to be somebody who's going to want to put the time in, like he put the time in over the years to keep these lineages going, keep everything pure. Well, I hope there is too, man. I think I give the hobby a lot more credit nowadays, and we mentioned this last time we talked. And I compare it to the whole bioactive movement in the hobby. There's a new generation of breeder that thinks differently than the old generation. And the new generation really does get off on the stuff you're talking about more than you think. So I give it a lot more hope than where it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the mindset of the hobby was very different.
I think the only problem with the bioactive people is they're never going to produce anything. In the sense, they're never going to produce anything in enough quantity to keep anything going. Because if all you do is you keep a small collection in giant, awesome cages, that's cool. Those snakes will look cool. That's awesome. But you're not going to put out enough numbers to keep this self-sustaining into perpetuity. Like, it's like, because you're limited, because the size of enclosures mandates you have to have a much smaller collection. And so a lot of the stuff will just fall by the wayside because there just isn't enough cage space in that universe to do it all. To keep 4 different bloodlines of a species going separate and maintaining separate genetic lineages of 4 different things. You might have one species, one lineage might be doing great, but you're not going to keep all 4 going in that scenario because it just takes up too much space and resources.
I guess what I really mean by that, though, is less about them breeding these animals in bioactives and more about this generation coming up that's actually a little more nerdy for the hobby, that they would go through the trouble of creating these bioactives to keep a Nolan that they bought for $3 at the fucking show kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, there's just a different motivation, I feel, with some of these kids coming up. And I think you'll be surprised how many purists show up in the next 5 or 10 years in the hobby.
Well, that's sort of where
I hope.
I see myself sort of as I get older, and I don't ever want to retire because I have the most awesome job in the world. I mean, I get to play with snakes all day and like travel around and I have the most awesome job ever. I don't want to quit doing that. But as you get older, it's like the ability to keep as many as I do and do them justice and produce as many, that will go down. So my plan is to kind of fade out and over the next like 20 years to have fewer and fewer snakes in correspondingly larger and more elaborate enclosures. I want to be like a 75-year-old dude with like 10 snakes in awesome setups. You know what I mean? Still producing a little bit of this and that, but not so much. And really do that because it's a different aspect of the hobby. And I think it has its own rewards unto itself.
Sure. I'm sure in the different pythons you work with, when people say this is a Nick Mutton animal, it's held to a little higher pristine. Am I right?
I don't know. I mean, my name gets thrown around a lot, sometimes for stuff I didn't even produce. I've seen Nick Mutton line jungle jags. I'm like, I would never make a jungle jag. Like, I see my name slapped on things I had nothing to do with. Like, I don't know. Like, I think because I'm like the militant purist guy, that it's kind of like sometimes in some circles might be viewed as a bit of a certificate of authenticity sort of thing. And so then it's therefore most years, at least once, I have to kind of like have a talking to with somebody who's like attached my name to something I cleared fraudulently for obvious reasons, like that, there was, last year was somebody with some albino Darwin carpets that I had nothing to do with. They had even gone to my website and got like clutch ID numbers and claimed it was from this clutch. And it's like, but they picked the wrong clutch because that was a clutch that I only had ever let 2 snakes go from the whole clutch. And I knew they're friends of mine. They still had them. It's like, I didn't sell those to you. Like, I don't, this kind of stuff. So I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of one of those. I think I probably have an overall favorable opinion, what am I? Word I'm looking for? Reputation. But you'll find people that don't like me because, well, I mean, look at this podcast. Like, I will say the thing. I will just, some people. I come across as abrasive, I guess, and arrogant at times to some people. I think because I'm not afraid to just tell people like I see it, I guess.
Well, I'll be honest. After the last podcast, especially with where you talked about genetics, I thought you and Junior would be a good match. Now that I hear you shit on monitors, I think we need to get with Mike's monitors and do an episode together next.
Oh, I've never talked to Mike from Mike's monitors, but I'm betting he probably would agree that there's no way these are all the same genus. It's insane. It's insane that they're all in the same genus. Like, I'd be surprised too. I have no comments at all about the species level designations of what's a species. I have nothing to say about that at all. It's just the absurdity that they're all in the same genus is this like an insane thing, like, to me. But
hey, Nick, I got this one for you. This is it's kind of relevant to understanding, like, what differentiates these animals, their DNA. It's like, look at ball python. Just recently, I'm like, how did they just recently, like, it was like 5, 6, 7 years ago, find out that pythons are XXXY chromosome instead of ZZZW? How did that go overlooked for many decades? If they're doing
nobody
DNA,
bothered to look. They was always there. Nobody bothered to look.
Yeah, it is assumed. So that's like
it's assumed that all snakes must be ZW, because we knew that colubrids and a lot of that stuff was. So that was just an assumption. But it turned out to be incorrect, except for your Madagascar boas, which are ZW. So it's like, but that is that. Again, there's not a lot of research funds going around to figure out the sex chromosomes of some pet pythons. It's kind of so.
I wonder if all colubrids are ZZZW. I would think that.
I don't know. The Colubridae that's a lot of snakes. So I would be a little surprised if you didn't see some outliers and some of them doing different things. But I don't know. I think people don't. If you look at like the divergences between species and genera and groups of animals, some of this stuff is way, way, way older. And some of these divergences are so deep. I think most people be just shocked to find out when the last common ancestor of like a Candoya boa, a Madagascar boa, and a red-tailed boa is at a time so remote to us, it's unimaginable. Like, the fact that you have boas in the South Pacific, in New Guinea, and on the Solomon Islands, and into Indonesia, you have like those Candoya boas in the South Pacific. I think a lot of people think, well, boas are from South America, and that they must have like rafted to get there. It's like, nope, they've been there in the same. Those boas didn't do anything. They're sitting in the same place they've always been, and the ground underneath them has drifted that far. That's how long ago it's been. Antarctica, South America, Africa, and all this stuff is part of Gondwana. And so this is why you have marsupials in Australia, but also marsupials in South America. The linkage was through Antarctica. It was that long ago. That's how long these things have been separated. It's like, but if you look at a red-tailed boa, and if you look at the pattern of a Dumerel's boa, you see common pattern characteristics that they still have from a shared common ancestor that was like 60 million years ago, and they still have some common pattern traits involved. It's like reptiles don't evolve super quickly. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, how we are a very young species as Homo sapiens. We, I don't know where you want to draw the line, but I think most paleoanthropologists peg our sort of coming of age at about 300,000 years ago, which is fuck all nothing in the grand scheme of things. That's nothing. And the 300,000-year-old archaic Homo sapiens fossils didn't look a whole lot like us. That's from a place called Jebel Erhoud in Morocco, for the rec. But no chin, brow ridges. This is a very not like us at all. Like it's a questionable call to attribute them to Homo sapiens. Even
doesn't sound very attractive. Your explanation does not sound like a very attractive looking.
You'd think that, but then like I saw like one of the most enlightening things about human evolution and paleoanthropology ever was I used to have a subscription to National Geographic many years ago, and they had done like 3-dimensional scans of like some well-preserved Neanderthal skulls of like a child and like an adult male. And then knowing the average tissue depth and all that for Homo sapiens, arguing is probably fairly similar, they took 3D scans of the skull of a normal dude and a child of approximately the same age. So you had like a photo of the person, and you knew the exact skull proportions of that person. And then you had the skull from Neanderthal, and they were able to digitally in a computer just swap skulls. So the computer then took the skin of the person, wrapped it around the digital reconstruction of the skull, and you had what looked like a photograph of a living Neanderthal in every detail. You couldn't tell the photo did not look altered. It looked like it just deformed it to accommodate the dimensions of the other skull, since you had 3-dimensional scans of both. And while not the most attractive guy you'd ever seen, if you put him on a ball cap and a coat and he went to Walmart, you wouldn't have even noticed.
Oh, really?
That's how close. It's like, yeah, it's like you wouldn't have necessarily you wouldn't have thought that's a really handsome dude, but you would not have paid any attention at all. It would have walked right past him. So it's not that much, and even that divergence is 600,000 years, which is fuck all nothing in the grand scheme of things. So little that we separated, and then 550 over 500,000 years after we separated, we intergressed with them, and that's why both of you guys are probably 1.5 to 2% Neanderthal now. Those genes are in you right now from that integration. And even after 500,000 years, you're still so close you can still interbreed readily. And there's multiple waves of that happen. What?
Isn't there some person like there was somebody that was like 3% or higher Neanderthal?
Yeah.
They're like really rare.
Yeah, this gets wonky with paleoanthropology and talking about human origins, but that's a subject I'm super interested in. But
oh, really?
The Neanderthal genome has never been more prevalent than it is right now. There are more Neanderthal genes on Earth now than there ever has been, and they're extinct. Because the 2% that you have and the 2% that Dave has, and the probably lower percentage that I have because of my ancestry, it's not necessarily the same 2%. Roughly about 40-odd% of the entire Neanderthal genome is still alive and living people. Because if you took the 2% that everybody has, it's not always the same 2%. There are more Neanderthal genes now. At the genomic level, they've never been more successful. 40,000 years after they went extinct, their genes have never been more, more common throughout the world.
That sounds like successful hybridization.
It is. It's what you'd call adaptive introgression, I think. But
okay.
But there's a lot of that, and that's the story of humanity. But it's also the story of carpet pythons and boas and monitors and everything. If two animals are close enough to do it and they run into each other, they probably will. So you see this all the time in the animal kingdom. But if you want to understand relationships between species and within clades and all this stuff, this is a factor. It's a way bigger factor than we even 20 years ago thought. What modern genomics has showed us is that this is really common. Like I'm sitting here and I probably am a 4-way hybrid of 3. I probably will certainly have very small amounts of 3 additional hominid species that were not Homo sapiens in me right now. I will have a small percentage of Denisovin genes that came over the Bering Land Bridge from Central and East Asia and got into my Native American heritage. I will have a very small percentage of a ghost lineage in my genome from West Africa because slavery. So, because we know that in one particular area, there's a genetic signature shows up in there. We don't have any fossils, but you can see a little bit of archaic DNA that's not from any known group. So those people at some point in the past interbred with another lineage of an earlier version of humanity that we don't have a name for. And it's all in us. But we're not any different than anything else. We've just studied our own genomes more, so we figured it out. It's not that, we're different than these monitors or these pythons or any of this stuff. This happens all the time. We know for a fact this happens in polar bears and brown bears. You have glacial and interglacial cycles. When you have a particularly warm interglacial, there's no sea ice or almost no sea ice. What happens to the polar bears? They're on the land. They're not on the ice. Guess who lives on the land? brown bears, and brown bears and polar bears hybridize. And so you'll see at different points in their genome, you'll see periods of time where there's a little bit of a signature of brown bear DNA introgressing into polar bears and vice versa that coincides with these warm periods of time where the sea ice was so reduced where they were forced to come into contact with each other. And so, but it doesn't mean a polar bear is not a polar bear and a brown bear is not a brown bear, but it shows this happening. And that the further you look into genomes of anything, you'll see these sorts of, if you look close enough, you're going to find this sort of stuff. And that has a much bigger sort of role in evolutionary change and than we previously believed is interesting. Like, well, people that live on the Tibetan plateau permanently live at a very high altitude. They have a mutation that allows them, that affects the hemoglobin in their blood, that allows them to do just fine at that higher altitude. They have a mutation that allows them to, that allows that. That mutation didn't come from Homo sapiens. That came from interbreeding. When people showed up in that area, there was already people living there from a different species that they interbred with, and that gene has been conserved in modern humans, but they came from a lineage of people called Denisovans that don't have a taxonomic designation. It's a Neanderthal sister group in Asia, but that gene persists because it came from them. So
this is all over my head.
It's interesting. It's like, but this is like, I guess it transcends like this snake and that snake. It's like, this is how life works, how biology works, how speciation works. It's the whole thing, you know, the whole machine. And this is, we just know a lot more about ourselves because we study ourselves more than we study anything else. But if you were to really put that much research into any of these pythons behind me, you'll see adaptive integration. And there is some instances where we do know about some of that even within one particular python. So it's like, it's not a unique story. It's just, we know that story. And I tell those stories because it's easier for people to understand conceptually because it's personal. It pertains to them. So it kind of hits home and it makes it a little more, I don't know, real, if that makes sense. Less abstract.
I thought you were just making fun of my forehead the entire time when you said I was a higher percentage than you, but I might not have been following.
No, I just, my own like sort of ethnographic makeup being what it is, I would logically have a lower percentage of Neanderthal gene, but I would have a higher percentage of the other two groups. You probably have none of one and almost none of the other.
Is that because my sweater, or where are you getting that from? My beard? What are we talking right now?
Where's your ancestry from?
I'm not really sure. I never did that 23andMe thing.
It's interesting when you learn about that kind of stuff, because mostly it's looking like haplotype groups and stuff. But it's interesting to know where you came from and the story that led to you.
Well, there's this rare chance I could still become a serial killer someday, and I don't want to make it easy to find me.
Well, there is that. I mean, it's like better safe than sorry, I suppose.
That's funny. I said my sister, you know that
never too late to give up on your dreams.
With that SpongeBob meme where he goes like that. I sent that to my sister after she got a DNA test. I was like, when I found my sister's spitter DNA, so now I can never become a serial killer if I want to.
Glad we're all thinking the right way.
I had my DNA looked at once, but it didn't test for Neanderthal genome stuff. So I think I'm going to go with a different one this time and stuff. Just because I want to know that percentage. And I'm pulling for a high number. I think that's awesome. Like, I want give me as much archaic DNA as I can. Like, I think that's cool. So I'll be disappointed if it's a super low number.
No, I will put more effort into the gene, or like my lineage, I guess you put it. I know we started in Canada as moonshiners and worked our way down to New York. Of course, before that, who knows? But I know I have some old writings from my grandmother. She put a lot of effort into this before she passed away. I just haven't opened the books yet.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's a story of of where you came from, how you came to be. And I'm personally more interested in like the deeper history of that, like, the genetic level and the species level and the kind of, you can, I don't know. It's interesting. You can, I don't know, it takes like these big concepts and everything and makes them personal and important to the individual, not like some vague nebulous sort of thing. It makes it very real when you see that about yourself or about people and whatnot. So I find that stuff endlessly fascinating. So,
were there questions we were supposed to answer for anybody?
Oh yeah, get some
probably way back. Yeah, there's actually a lot of people talking for a bit.
Yeah, a lot of chatter. Good.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm starting to be getting most of its comments about Dave's appearance. Hold on.
Oh, shoot.
Avery asked if there are any python species you'll have that's your favorite or your least favorite species of python. I'm going to think you don't even have a least favorite.
Both.
Oh, you do have both. Okay.
My favorite species is the Centralian, aka Brettles python. I think they're just about the perfect pet python. I have more of them than anybody in the history of the world has probably ever had. I have to avoid breeding 80% of them so I don't destroy the entire market in one season by myself. So I have 16 adult females that can all lay 20 eggs at a pop. So in a typical year, I'll breed 3, maybe 4, and that's it. So in any year, I never ever breed more than 25% of my females because it's just too many, but I just like them. So I have to
are
really sandbag on that to keep the market stable because as an individual, I could completely mess that up. So I just don't breed them. What?
The Brettles are really pretty. Actually, that's what I remember seeing them when I don't know, it was like they're rough. Like I remember when Casey Lazick was like selling them, and they're like, what, like 5,000 a pair or 75? I think they're 7,500 a pair or 10 grand.
I got my first pairs. They were 5,000, 2.2 at 5,000 a pair. It was a long time ago.
I remember it something like that, 5 or 75. And then it wasn't Trinity. She already answered it, but is Susie, a friend of mine. She asked you about your books, and then you told us about the complete Anastasia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and then you have the 2 complete carpet pythons, and you're working on a much larger book, which is cool. And
Asphodite's book. The Asphodite's book will be done in the
Asphodite's. What's Asphodite's? Is that water pythons?
Nah, it's your black-headed pythons and womas.
Oh, okay. I should know that, but I didn't, I guess. Now I do. Unless I forget.
Divergent, phenotypically divergent, behaviorally divergent from the other pythons.
Right, they have no heat pits in their face, which is fascinating. It's fascinating that they're even in the same genus. I mean, but like I don't know, like on
they're not.
They're not.
They have their own genus, but they don't. They were mistakenly believed to be the most basal and primitive. Primitive is the wrong word, but the most basal python because they lacked heat pits. The assumption was that since there's so many pythons in Australia, pythons must have originally evolved in Australia. And this must be the oldest lineage of them because they don't even have heat pits yet. Turns out that's completely ass backwards, and they're relatively recent arrivals in Australia. And that it's not that they never had heat pits, it's that they secondarily lost their heat pits. Because if you mostly eat reptiles and you're swimming around like a sandbow in loose sand, having your forward-facing heat pits clogged with sand sucks, which you don't even need them if you eat cold-blooded prey half the time.
Sure.
So it's just, they became a liability, not an asset, so they were lost secondarily. It's not that they never had them. When you look at like water pythons, their heat pads are kind of reduced because they're not as things that aren't needed tend to go away. It's easier to lose a characteristic than to gain one. So
it's probably so like hognose snakes too, like not really needing real potent venom. So it basically becomes secondary, something that just kind of helps them if they have to chew on a prey item for quite a long time, and they leak more and more of it, subdues them. So yeah, it's interesting because like I've actually always wondered that about the Woma and the blackheads because like these things don't even have heat pits. Yeah, they primarily eat lizards. They're so much different from all other pythons. Yeah. But then the interesting thing is that you can actually hybridize them. You can hybridize a Woma with a ball python.
Yeah, well, I guess you can do it because it doesn't go anywhere because the offspring are infertile. So
they are? Okay.
Knock yourself out. Like, you never seen a 75% Woma ball? Nope.
No, I have not.
With hybridizing pythons, I hate to even talk about it because I don't want to encourage people to do what I consider to be detrimental things to the hobby. But what you find is with very, very few, maybe even no exceptions, you have 2 different radiations of pythons. And they parted ways a long time ago. You have the Afro-Asian radiation. So basically all your mainland Asian and African species. And then you have the Australopapuan radiation, which is everything east of the Wallace line, basically, in your New Guinea and Australian pythons. And if you hybridize animals from within that radiation, if you breed a blood python to a ball python, they're fertile. If you breed 2 Australian pythons together, they're probably fertile. If you breed an Australian python to an African python, not fertile. the last common ancestor of those animals is like over 30 million years ago. It's really deeply diverged. You originally had 3 radiations of pythons. Pythons appear to have evolved in what's now South Asia, Southeast Asia-ish, vaguely ballpark. You had 1 radiation into Europe. You had 1 radiation into east into Africa, and then you had a radiation west that went, or east rather, than all the way to Australia, west to Africa into Europe. During the Eocene, global temperatures were a lot warmer. So you have a lot of fossil pythons from Germany and places that were not hospitable to pythons now. So you had a pretty booming population and radiation of European pythons and European boas too, that were doing just fine, but gradually the climate changes and that's no longer, that radiation goes extinct, leaving only the 2. But that branch point between the Afro-Asian and the Australopapuan stuff is so far back that hybrids between those 2 groups don't really, you can do it, but with low fertility clutches and the offspring don't seem to be fertile. But if they're infertile, then it doesn't really cause any problems. So if you want to do it, I guess knock yourself out. Make all the woke balls you want. They're weird. They're really weird looking.
They are weird looking. Aren't green tree? Never mind. Yeah, I was thinking of something else. Because the green tree carpet hybrids, I've seen a lot of those. I think the hybridization is like I'm not pro or like I'm not like against it either. I'm not really pro it. I think it is a little interesting because by breeding, let's say an African species python to an Australian species and them being infertile. I think that speaks volumes to like their relation and stuff. While these Australian species that hybridize are able to reproduce, and so I think it helps a little bit with taxonomic understanding. Even though there's a lot
less of hybridization that's done with Australian species. You have a lot of people down there right now because they have a closed sort of hobby. They don't get species from outside of Australia, and they try to turn everything in Australia into ball pythons. Except for what they do, like with the Antaresia, you have like 5 species of them, and there's a bunch of different morphs in all the different species. So now you just have a bunch of like multi-morph hybrid Antaresia that are 3-way hybrids to get the marble gene with the albino gene from spotted pythons, this kind of stuff. And those are fertile. The chondro carpet hybrids are not totally infertile, but they are extremely fertility challenged. Like, you can get them to breed, but what it seems like is that the 50% animals generally have to breed them back to one or the other parent species. No one ever gets a clutch from breeding 50% carpondros to each other. It doesn't really seem to work. So which again shows you that they shouldn't be in the same damn genus. Like chondros should be in chondropython. The only thing that has any business being in Morelia is carpet pythons. The fact that the green pythons are still in Morelia is also stupid. It's but there we are. There are fertility challenge. There have been carpet python, water python, carpet python, scrub python, but these things, have happened, but no one really, I don't know. They never were raised to maturity and then bred to see if they were fertile or anything like that. I know somebody that bred a Tanimbar python. I don't know somebody. I know somebody that got suckered into buying a Tanimbar python, jungle carpet python hybrid in Europe, which was, I found hysterical because this guy had done some shady stuff anyway and he got hosed. Somebody did this hybrid pairing. The babies were weird as shit and they sold them to him as a new morph of jungle carpet. And there's like some undoubtedly sterile freaking mutt hybrids and everything. And it's like, yeah, it was weird. I wish I could dig up those pictures, but
that sounds like something somebody in the reptile hobby would do. Now, this one might be a long tangent.
I know who this is. It's Brandon. That's Brandon Wheeler. Aliens from another planet or another dimension?
Yes.
Question like,
do you have any opinion on that one?
On extraterrestrial life, I have lots of opinions on it. I guess it's kind of all pretty speculative. I think it'd be pretty naive to think that we're the only game in town. I mean, it's like, I think that if you have trillions of galaxies, each one with trillions of stars, and each of those stars with multiple planets, plus trillions of rogue planets in each galaxy, the statistical probability is being what it is, that even if complex a technological life like us is the rarest mathematical thing you could possibly even calculate. It's probably happened a bunch of times just because the numbers are so big. But just because alien life has existed, almost certainty, it doesn't mean it overlaps temporally with us. You also have to add in the extra dimension of time. And if you have a universe that's almost 14 billion years old, you probably had hundreds of advanced civilizations that have come, gone, become extinct, and are in the dustbin of history. And it might just be we're the only ones around right now. In 100 million years, maybe we'll be gone and somebody else will be there, but you don't necessarily overlap temporally. So, and that's your solution to the Fermi paradox. Where are all the aliens? They're dead.
This problem, Monroe Morphs is asking about, I think it's more like a statement, but there's the wobble alert on complex genes minus the vehicle trait spot noses. It's only the super form, but I've seen more shaky wobble spot nose versus spiders over the years. Yeah, Dave, I don't know if you know much about that, but yeah, I didn't know that, but I heard spot nose have a little bit of a wobble, but overall spot nose is pretty undetectable, but the super form, it's got a little more of a wobble.
I have a friend who very early on bought some early spot nose stuff, and it was just starting to come out that the super spot nose, the quote unquote Powerball, was kind of a bit off, and he produced a few, and they were absolute train wrecks. They were a little impaired. They were fucked up. Like, fucked up. Like, it was like, that's not cool. Like, that's like, it was not like, it was way worse than a spider. They were bad.
Oh, really?
Sure, some are not as bad. Things like that sort of impairment tends to vary in how much it's expressed, but the ones I saw were babies, and they were a hot mess. Beautiful too, beautiful snakes, but just a mess. What do you think about JAG and retics? I've heard differing opinions. I don't know. I don't know enough about it to, pontificate about it enough. I guess I would want to have more information before I formed an opinion. I don't know enough about that particular morph and retics, if it's similar to something we've seen before. So I don't know. I don't follow retics because it's too frustrating. Frankly, it's a species complex of snakes that's really awesome, but the hobby's so consumed with morphs that all they could think to do is hybridize them out of existence. So much so, it's gotten so bad that I've had to buy pairs of all 4 species of retics just because I don't think that if I waited 5 years, I'll be able to find them. I think they won't even, I don't have any confidence the retic community will keep them alive. I think it's all about it. And some of the other ones are increasingly difficult to find. So, and there are 4 species. There are 3 described species of retic and 1 undescribed. That's a slam dunk too. That eventually will be recognized. And so,
what species is that?
What?
What species retic is that?
Oh, all the secrets. The Philippine ones.
Okay.
The Philippine ones are
so I can
very distinctive and are reproductively isolated and are genetically different. They are a species, but it was like the paper that showed how different they were wasn't really a paper that was written with the idea of, it was looking at that. It wasn't, their goal wasn't to break off a new species. They were looking into other things. And it was kind of one of those, they made this finding, but they stopped short of naming them because that really wasn't, it was outside of the scope of what they were even trying to do. But the data is there. They are a different species. That's, abundantly clear. So that's why I have all 4 species of retic, and I'm not even into retics. I want to be able to breed them all at some point before I die. And if I don't get them now, I don't have any confidence they'll be around in 10 years. So I better do it now. Hybrid people and retic hybrid people try to do the math and tell me what percentage their babies are. It's like, oh, Lisa, you talk about the percentage of hybrids, and I'm like, yeah, who cares? Who cares? It's like, if you're not 100% a thing, who gives a shit? Oh, it's 75%. It's 57.6%. Who cares? If you're not 100% diamond python, who cares? You're a hybrid. You're just denoting, what does the concentration mean? To most people, I don't understand that. With the retic people, they think that the higher percentage of dwarf blood means that their retic's going to stay small, but it won't. If you just keep feeding it, it'll just keep getting big anyway. So it doesn't even work like that. Dwarfism is not a morph. It's not a thing. It's not like that. There's a genetic component and there's an environmental component to why those dwarf retics are small. and one influences the other. The reason why they're small is because there's nothing big to eat. If there were freaking wild pigs and freaking orangutans to eat on those islands, they'd be huge retics. They only got small because there was a dearth of large prey to support them. So species have a pretty profound ability to upsize or downsize to new environments. So they shrunk. But that's the lack of suitable prey was the driver for that. And eventually there becomes a genetic sort of component to it, but that is only part of it. At best, it's only a component to why they're smaller. And if you overfeed them, you can overwhelm that very quickly. I had two female 10 and a half foot Kayuwadi retics that I got from a guy. They were huge because he overfed them. That same guy had a 15-foot Jampia retic. A 15-foot dwarf retic is not a dwarf retic. Turns out, if you feed the shit out of them, they'll just get big because any little bit of genetic distinction that's happened. Here's how you know if a species is on its road to becoming a true dwarf. It's when the incubation time goes down and the egg size goes way down. When they start having shorter incubation times, like retics incubate for a long time. When you start seeing when you start seeing like 60-day incubation times instead of 80 or 90, small eggs that cook in like 2 months instead of 3 months, that's when you know you're on the road to something that's really entrenched at a genetic level. If you look at Tannenbar pythons, the dwarf scrub python, never mind that I've had males breed at 400 grams. A scrub python, big old scrub pythons, 400 grams is this big around. And the males are breeding at that size. And the eggs are the size of a carpet python egg, and they incubate for 61 days, whereas a third less time than any other scrub python. Like they are a real dwarf that's been there doing that for a long time. But why are they a dwarf? Because there's nothing big to eat in that archipelago. There's a cockatoo on that island, the smallest cockatoo, the Goffin's cockatoo, which is also endangered. Yeah, it's not a coincidence that the smallest cockatoo lives on the island with the smallest scrub python. That probably eats the smallest cockatoo, for that matter. It's like this island's resource poor, everything gets smaller. Insular dwarfism is a really common phenomenon. So,
I asked your favorite python's bridles. I forgot. Did you answer what your least favorite python was?
I did not. Blood pythons.
Oh, really? What the fuck? They're cool. Hey, I want to see somebody hybridize a blood python to an African rock just to make a fucking crazy abomination.
Be like the meanest, nastiest.
Yeah, I know. It'd be so cool.
God, and it would just be shit brown because anytime
the pattern's gonna look
at
wild.
A genetic level, snakes that are red are just barely red. When you dilute the red snake with anything, you just get brown.
I know, but it's gonna be the pattern's gonna be crazy. It's
gonna
be
weird and crazy and just shithouse nasty. Like
it's gonna be so cool. Somebody's got to do it. Kevin's got to do it. Kevin
I'm on a mission to breed the most python species that anybody's ever bred, and it's kind of a little like competition with me and a good friend of mine, Ryan Young, and I think he's a good handful of species ahead of me. A big part of that was he bred all those short tail pythons because I don't like them. Like, so it's just like friendly competition. Who can breed the most species? Like, all right, let's do this. And I have a pair of they're T-negative albino bloods, and I have never hated a snake more than I hate those snakes.
Why?
They're the nastiest, aggressive. They have a short strike, but they have no tail. They don't have a handle. They're so short and squatty that you can't get them on a hook, and they hate my guts, and it is mutual. Like the minute I hatch an egg from those things, I'm giving the adults away for free. So if you want a pair of adult breeder, the minute the eggs, I gotta wait till an egg hatches. If I see a head poking out of the egg, and I can say I bred them, I will give those things away to the first person who'll take them.
I'll take them. I'm taking them right now.
I thought I had a dick. She laid 4 bum eggs because I'm not breed feeding them a lot. Maybe because I don't like them, but I got
What's your favorite?
4 infertile eggs. I'm like, oh, I just want them gone.
What's your least favorite and favorite short tail?
Oh, the bloods are the worst. The other two I like a lot more. I don't know that I like them, but I have everything.
You like Sumatran short tails better than bloods, and then I like Sumatrans actually.
I have them all. I have all 3.
Okay.
I detest the bloods. I like the Sumatrans the most. They seem the most relaxed, and I like that all black snake where it's just almost.
They are cool.
Black.
Yeah.
I like that. I like the blackness of it, and I have a couple pairs of Borneos that I don't totally hate. But the bloods are the worst. I don't know. Maybe I've heard the albinos are worse than the regular ones. I don't know.
Interesting. I didn't know that the blood's temperament was that much different because, like, my Sumatran short tails, 2 are really chill. Even if I don't hold her for a long time, if I take her outside or hold her anything, she's actually pretty good. Then I have the one male. He's actually gotten better. He used to like wind up, like you could see him. He'd be like trembling and all tense and getting ready. You know, like he's like, you know, he's just like this, getting ready just to fucking try to smack you as hard as he could with his mouth.
I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions on all blood pythons. My sample size is 2.
Okay.
I've had other Sumatrans. I've had other Borneos. I've only ever had the one pair of bloods, and I hate them, and they hate me. I'm sure there are other ones that have got. They can't all be like this, or no one would keep them. If everybody's were this bad, no one would want to work with these things. I also don't like how they're all of the group, how they tend to never shit, and they just eat and they drink and they eat and they drink and they don't piss and they don't shit and they never piss and they never shit. And then one day they lay a shit the size of my forearm and 2 quarts of piss comes out and it swamps the entire cage. It's like, whoa! It's like they just store it up for so long and then drop this neutron bomb of fecal matter all at once. It's like, I don't like that. I'd rather just come out in drips and drabs so I can spot clean or do whatever and keep up on it rather than just be this.
Everything you're saying makes them sound kind of appealing, really.
Like it. I've been keeping pythons for so long, but it's kind of a weird thing to talk about. But like I have one big ass female berm because she won't lay eggs for me. I just want to breed them once, and then I'm going to find somebody local that wants a pair of proven berms. They can just have them. Just come get them.
The Everglades.
I'm not trying to ship this snake that weighs probably 45 pounds now. It's like, I'll just give them away once I hatch an egg, but he doesn't want to breed her very well. And then she doesn't lay. I'm like, I need these things out of here. And, that snake laid a shit the size of my arm. I could not believe, like, it turns out if you feed a snake like a 15-pound Flemish giant rabbit, like it was like a loaf of bread. I couldn't believe it. It was like, this is like, you see people sometimes people will take a picture of a giant shit and you're like, what's going on? Why are you posting that? And like, I almost did. I'm like, fuck, I kind of want to take a picture of this. This is damn impressive. Like, it's like, oh my god! Like
that is impressive. You know, it'd be even more if you were able to like scoop it up with a shovel, keep it intact, place it outside, and then plant like a tomato plant on it or something, and show the progression of the shit deteriorate, like breaking down and everything, and a tomato plant growing from it.
Smuggled into the Walmart, the public bathroom at a Walmart, and just put it next to somebody's line or something. Like, holy shit! Like, oh my god! And yeah. I don't know. I kind of made me laugh. I was like, wow, that's
all right, Nick. Here's one. This is like Komodo dragons have bacteria in their mouth, and ball pythons must be ZZZW. This one's worse at least, as I've heard that they hold in all of their shit as a counterweight so they can strike faster. There's no way that's the reason they're holding this shit. That's pretty funny though.
Oh man, yeah, they're at least my pair. They're awful. And I have a lot of snakes that really are unpleasant. A lot of thoroughly unpleasant. I have a lot of scrub pythons and a lot of just nasty. And when you have as many snakes as me, it's like I'm not going to be able to work with these things and try to calm them down. If you're going to be a jerk, you're just going to stay a jerk. It's like, okay, I just accept them for what they are. And if like they're going to be aggressive, I'm not going to make any effort to change that. I don't have time. Who's got 20 minutes a week to just handle all these snakes? There's like, I would need to hire somebody who just handles snakes for a living for 40 hours a week, just handling stuff. It's like, I'll just have a long hook and I'm good at dodging strikes and moving on.
Do you have any Colubrids? Do you keep any?
Yes, but they're just like, when I got into the hobby 30 years ago, the normal sort of trajectory is your beginner snakes were like your North American Colubrids. And that's what you got into. And then you paid your dues with the Colubrids, and then you worked your way up to pythons and this other stuff that was more expensive. And that was and I just kind of skipped right to pythons because that was what was interesting to me. And I'll admit it was ignorant of me. I was really kind of had not a negative view of like Colubrids, but I kind of looked down on them like, oh, those are just beginner snakes. And like and you take for granted that it can't be that cool. They live in North America, so that must make it not cool. So I skipped all that. And then as I've gotten older and hopefully a little bit wiser, I realized I was an idiot and that some of the most beautiful snakes in the world live in North America, that we have some of the most awesome snakes ever right here. And I never paid attention to them ever because my snobby attitude about it. So now I mean, be honest. Like all these ball python morphs, cool. All my Australian pythons, cool. Show me one snake that can hold a candle to a 50-50 cow king, a really nice 50-50 black and white wild cow king. That is one of those beautiful snakes on the planet. It's insane. And they're just out there in a rock pile somewhere, right in North America. I've caught them, found them. Like I found one in Utah. About shit my pants, the most beautiful snake I've ever seen in my life. Just crossing the road. I'm like, wow. It's like, so now I have that stuff, but I have a strict no morph policy. And they're just for me. I've got some variable kings, some weird locality cow kings that no one gives a crap about, you know. Some gophers. I've got just some of this stuff that I just think is cool for me. I don't want morphs. I don't want them to be worth any money. I don't want that pressure. I just want to enjoy them for what they are, for my own personal. I think these are cool. I'll try to breed them, but it's more just for me, you know. I don't need to make.
You know what? There's a community in Colubrids I think you'd fit in really nice. The gray bands.
Those guys are a cult, though. Like they're like. I am sympathetic to their worldview, but they are like kind of almost, it's almost too much of a cult. Like you got guys that won't breed snakes that didn't come out of the exact same section of rock cut. On
I know.
What? Like
that pisses me
it's
off.
The same snake, dude. It's like you can shine a flashlight and see the other rock pile over there. Like it ain't a different snake. Like I mean, I appreciate that those people exist. But man,
Rosy boa people are like that too, or used to be.
Some of them are ridiculous. Like I went down to this years ago. I went to I was a speaker at the Herpeton Symposium in San Diego, and I went out with some friends of mine, and we went down and along the border and everything. And I actually found like 3 rosy boas. I was super stoked. Found 2 of them just outside of Anza Borrego, you know, and big ones. These must have been like 200 years old. I've never seen a rosy boa that big ever, and they were both giant males. They were absolutely just. I was just shocked at how big these things were. Huge. They must have been super old. And I posted a picture of one, and then all these rosy boa people like, that's not an Anza Borrego rosy boa, and they're like just talking out of their asses, like, you know, thinking they know what every rosy boa is supposed to look like in a particular area or something. Like, that's obviously an escapee. It's like you're trying to tell me you think somebody caught a wild rosy boa somewhere else, then drove to Anza Borrego, let it go, and then by happenstance another dingling herper, me, found the same damn snake at some point later. It's like, get the fuck out of here. Like, they're variable. They're old and dark. They look like they're 2,000 years old. They look like they're fossils. They're obviously super old and big and dark. And it's like, this is not, it's like, that's almost too, I mean, I'm going to call it a day. If you can find it in the wild in that place, it's probably what it is, isn't it? You know, but which, you're a Hognose guy. I have a question for you. I'm going to turn this shit around on you.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to shame you guys a little bit in the Hognose community. Why is there no locality Hognose hobby?
Oh,
why?
There used to be.
There should still be. Why has the Hognose been so co-opted by the only thing on earth that matters is mutant? When they range all the way from Canada to Mexico, and you have all these different populations of them, and there's got to be something that where's like, why can't I find like a locality Hognose? Because I would like to have a pair of just normal ass locality Hognoses. Like
they're around. The problem is like there's a few reasons to it. Actually, when I was getting into Hognose at first, it was really hard to find a captive born one. It was a lot of wild caughts. My first 4 Hognose I got were wild caught. I bought some Mexican Hognose as Westerns. I mean, technically, sometimes they just call anything that's a Plains or a Mexican. I mean, even at that young age, I was really nerding out about Hognose. So I already knew that I was buying a Mexican, but I was so desperate to buy a fucking Plains Hognose. If I could even find a Mexican Hognose, I'd buy it. But yeah, there's Craig Trumbauer. I got my red phase that I initiated, originally started my red projects with. Then those were Nebraska locality. Part of the problem, Nick, is there's legality things for a lot of these locales. And there's a couple pricks in the hobby that if you said you had them from this state, they might want to try to make trouble for you. And then there's certain, like a lot of our original Hognose are from Southwest Texas, Lubbock. There's some neighboring areas, Midland, Texas. There'd be like a decent amount of Hognose taken from there. There's actually a decent amount of Hognose in Colorado because they're commonly found. I do have a pair of Yellowstone County Plains Hognose straight from the wild. And I do have one South Dakota individual. And, you know, these other states, yeah, you could I remember this, I've talked about this twice on recently. I don't think it was in a podcast, but on my Discord, sometimes we'll have these chats with 8 or 10 people. And this is like, yeah, because it's a very interesting topic because, yeah, hognose do have this really expansive range. Yeah. Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, there's some isolated populations. And the DNA of those guys up north are definitely different than the southern locales. You like this one, Nick. The first time I had sable like hognose, these are pure Montana locale hognose because the gene popped up from 2 wild-caught individuals. So even though it's a
Montana?
gene... yeah, in Montana, yeah. Sable's from Montana.
Who did the gene come from?
Dan Eby. He's kind of in
Okay,
Cascade
that's what
County.
I thought. Like, I know Dan a little bit. Like,
Okay.
I see it sometimes. Like,
yeah, so yeah, he's they're from the same. It's funny, he caught a couple others in that same area, bred them together. Those ones weren't het, so he came across those 2 individuals by this pond, and I'm pretty sure those ones are Cascade County. So when I had these original Montana locale het sables, and even when I outcrossed them, those eggs would hatch out 5 to 7 days faster than my other plains hognose eggs with mixed southern locales. I'm like, oh, that's fucking crazy. Like, these eggs would hatch out way faster. And I've had some other northern locales. But yeah, they're kind of just hard to get a hold of. There's a lot of states, unfortunately, where you can't. Now, Illinois, they're very protected. Like, but I'm just mentioning Illinois because Illinois, I can pretty much, like, if you show me, like, an iNaturalist, a plains hognose snake, I'm pretty accurate with telling the range it came from. I can usually kind of be pretty good at the state, or sometimes I'm off by a little bit. But if I go like the segments, the southern range versus the central and northerns kind of do have a little bit of a different look. It's definitely nuanced with some of them. The northern ranges are much darker. The Illinois and, funny enough, the Colorado, which are kind of like, distant, but they're kind of way in, that longitude is still kind of, close and kind of close. Latitude. But anyway, those ones are kind of like, they can be light colored. But so the thing is, like, the one thing is, like, I could show you a hognose from like South Dakota, Minnesota. They kind of look about the same. And there's a lot of, the other thing is too, it's just a lack of, space too, because I want to work on all these selectively line bred traits, all these morphs. I did have locales. I mixed most of them. I do have locales now. I've always been interested in locales. And there's because I jump around a lot. But the story I was going to talk about was, like, when I was in Daytona the very first time is 2002. I was just kind of there shopping. I only had like $550. It took me like 3 months to save up at the time. And anyway, there's this guy, and nobody will probably know who the hell he was. I was going to ask one other breeder. I think he may possibly know. So this was 2002, and it was kind of near the center. If you went right through the door, there's only a few tables over. He had no tablecloth, but he had, I'm not shitting you, he had Illinois locality county hognose plains, which at the time would still be illegal. He had, I know, Canada locale, whether they really were or not. I think I remember Montana and then a couple others. And I remember I kept coming back and looking at them because it was very peculiar. And the guy kept looking at me, especially because I was young. I was 15 at the time. So I kind of looked like somebody that might try to steal. I was probably acting like that too because I kept coming back and staring at them. And I was like, I wanted to buy some, but they were like $70 to $90 each. And I was like, man, I kind of wanted to work with other stuff. And I was looking at them. I was like, yeah, these ones look a little different, but nothing really intrigued me enough, I guess, to buy any of them. And then, like, yeah, within like the first day, he had like, I'm pretty sure like sold out. And I remember the guy was like bald, and I'm pretty sure had glasses, and I'd never seen him again. But yeah, then there was Craig Trumbauer. Yeah, and New Mexico hognose definitely look very different. And so sometimes you get New Mexico locale hogs. I know people with New Mexico locales. I'd say locales are a little more prevalent with Mexican hognose people, but Mexican hognose are kind of like, I don't really like keeping them. They're kind of like a shittier plains hognose with their behavior and feeding habits. So I'm like, I want the plains hognose, but with more worse qualities. No thanks. And then the northern locale hognose tend to be, because of where they're ranged from, it's longer winters, harsher environment, and I think they have to be a little more opportunistic. So those northern locales generally make better feeders. So if I'd wanted a locale, it'd be like up north. And then the cool thing though is, like, you can look at Montana and be like, well, there is enough counties where you could be like hundreds of miles apart and you can find them. So there is this one county where I'm going to try to herp for them, and I actually kind of have permission to go there. And one thing is too, jumping around, the northern locale, because their population densities seem to be smaller, not as easy to find. And then also you're not going to these prairies that have controlled burns. So they're like, have fun on my non-grazed 500 acres of like like fucking knee high to waist high grass that's splotchy, and you have to be there during the right the climate. Is good for finding them and everything, because you can go there, and if it's too hot, too dry, so you got to do a lot of try to plan or like leave when you have some time. It's like, oh, the temperatures look good.
I assume it's what's the legalities of collecting them in
Montana's fine. That's why Montana, you can take them there. And South Dakota's pretty okay. Wyoming, I think, is fine. Oklahoma, you need like a fishing license or hunting.
I'm just in Eastern Washington. I'm like half an hour from the Idaho border in Eastern Washington. Like,
yeah. You have to go to like.
I run into Dan Eby at local expos sometimes. Like,
yeah. Dan has them. Like, I've had some from Dan.
I'd like to go catch some myself. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, they're tough.
I don't want them to make money. I just would like to have a pair of Hognose in my little Colubrid collection just for my own amusement. I think to me that would be cooler if it's some weird county locality in Montana or something that's the kind of stuff that I would find interesting.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be interested in like Oklahoma or like Wyoming locality, because they're so rare and they're genetically different. So I would want to outcross them, but I would like some pure locales. The one thing I see is like the cool, like I'd say the locales with the most different look are some of them like just a little southwest of like Oklahoma City, and some of the areas of very northeastern extreme Texas where they could be pretty red. New Mexico, if you show me a Hognose from New Mexico, Plains Hognose, 99% of the time I'll get it correct. Every now and then there will be one that kind of looks just like a regular brown one that's like from Texas, which makes sense because New Mexico borders Texas. But I'd say maybe like 95% of the time, if you show me a wild Plains Hognose that's from New Mexico, I'll get it right, because they have a very distinct look. Even a new person, if you show them enough of them, they'll be like, oh, I see what you see. But then the northern locales, they kind of all look the same. But yeah, it is kind of unfortunate. And the thing is, though, but there's like people like Craig Trumbauer, he stopped working with Plains Hognose. I have no idea why. He has more bull snakes now. But yeah, there's not a lot of locale people. Dan is a little bit of a locale dude, but the other thing is too, the locales, I have a bit of a gripe with locales people sometimes too, because like you're saying, it's like the gray band of people, like they have to be within like in the rosy bows. I remember one guy was posting the locales he was breeding, and the ones were described as like from the side of Highway 44. So, they were exactly from this one side of the highway, this one particular area. And this one dude bred, I remember, one locality to another locality, and they were subspecies, and they were calling it a hybrid when he's naturally integrated in the wild. So he did an unnatural intergrade, or basically, so yeah, but I would like to get some more locale Plains Hognose.
I would like to just have, I think Hognose are neat snakes, but I'm not,
you need a hunting license for them in Texas. That's what I thought. In Oklahoma, too. I don't know about New Mexico. I'm sure it's like changed now. Most of the states have changed. Do you know the Cody from Rattlesnake Ranch?
I do not.
He has a really nice facility. And he actually, because he has a lot of native species, and he works with, pretty much just mostly a Crotalus. But yeah, he wanted Plains Hognose for me. But that's what he wanted too. Is you have like a locale or like a normal, something that's like a locale specific?
Yeah, with the Colubrid stuff, I just want to have a few things that I can just appreciate for the natural, beautiful animals that they are. I don't want to get bogged down trying to make morphs and all this kind of stuff. I don't want the pressure of like, oh my God, this costs a bunch of money. I need to breed it really fast. And I just want to I'll breed them whenever I feel like breeding them. I just want to have these things. I have 1 million snakes that pay my bills. I don't need that to be my bills. Some things I have like rhino rat snakes. I've got like just a bunch of randomy kind of things that I just think are just mainly just for my own personal. I might actually try to breed a pair of corn snakes. I've never bred a corn snake. I've never bred a North American Colubrid. In fact, the only Colubrid I've ever bred was African house snakes years ago. I've never even tried to breed a Colubrid. So I might try to breed. I have a pair of Okiti corn snakes. Just normal ass Okiti corn snakes, which I, again, think is one of the most beautiful snakes in the world. Like, if you're really honest, like pumpkin orange and black. It's crazy. They're beautiful. I don't care what they're worth. I don't even give a crap. I just like them. I'm going to try to breed them just because I never did. I skipped all that. Now I want to go back and just do it for my own personal enjoyment.
That is one thing, though, with like the localities, though. Sometimes when people will take the localities, they'll take the best examples, and they'll actually selectively line breed them to look better than any example you'd actually naturally find in the wild, too.
Oh, yeah.
I'm okay with it. But some of the purists with these locales, they kind of like contradict themselves because like, well, I want it to look like this, but then they selectively line breed one that looks substantially better than what you're going to find in the wild.
Well, that happens in like, I mean, I breed a lot of jungle carpet pythons. They're yellow and black. You know what you find if you go find a wild jungle carpet? You don't find neon yellow and jet black snakes.
Sure,
you find black and gold snakes. You find black, gold, and brown snakes. You find black, brown, and yellow snakes. You don't ever. The one thing you can almost be sure you're never going to find is a neon yellow and jet black snake. They've been selectively bred for so long that they're almost they are largely unnatural looking. It's like you didn't necessarily add genes from another species to do it, but it is. I'm actually trying to go the other direction. I have jungle carpets now that I'm trying to breed brown back into them. I'm trying to recreate some of the normal phenotypes that people have selectively bred out of existence to make a jungle carpet a pure jungle carpet that looks like it's supposed to look, or what a lot of the very variable. But the most common wild jungle carpet phenotype you'll see is like a black background that kind of fades like some brown kind of in the background, and then kind of yellowy gold banding. But there's definitely, it's like a 3-colored snake, black, brown, and gold, or black, brown, and yellow. And we just decided at some point we don't like that brown anymore. We just wanted it all black. I want to try to bring it back. I think that's a natural, kind of a cool look that nobody has. So try to steer the ship the other way, I guess.
Can I ask you a question about rhinos really quick that I've heard in the past? Have you ever heard of long-term exposure with UV increases blue pigment in the animal over time?
No, and that would be run counter to what we do know. That's analogous to a situation you see with, you know what green basilisk lizards are?
Mm-hmm. They're all over Florida, buddy.
What?
I said they're all over Florida.
The green ones now?
I want to say
the brown ones are
maybe it's the brown. Maybe it's the brown in Miami. I think it was the brown.
It looks like a freaking dragon. It's a freaking Kelly green freaking lizard with giant fins in its head and its back and orange eyes. It's the craziest looking thing. And captive bred ones are blue. They're not green. They're blue because the light they're exposed to and the food they're not eating. It's like they're in captivity. They end up blue. Giving them full spectrum light would, if anything, would seem like it would likely make them more green, not less green. But I don't know. Assuming that the mechanisms responsible for their color are largely the same as it would be in lizards anyway. But
okay, do you think the blue is just a variable in that species, or what do you think the blue is?
It could be. I mean, I have friends that keep, Barron's Racer is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like in some of those, there's a blue phase of Barron's Racer too.
Okay.
Could also be a mutation too, because you know what happens when you make a exanthic, as we discussed, is neither recessive nor exanthic. But the thing popularly called exanthic, if you have a green animal that you make exanthic, it's blue. You ever seen an exanthic tree frog or something? It's crazy blue color. Yeah, it's like, could be something along those lines too. I don't know. I like my rhino rats. I think it's a really neat species. If they could be blue, that would be cool. I would not be opposed to blue ones existing.
I'll have to look up some pictures. Some people are calling them exanthics, but then also apparently they don't make their color change till later in life.
Well, most green things a lot of green things aren't hatched out green. They become green over time. And rhino rats are not green when they're born. They don't hatch out green. They turn green. Chondros turn green. A lot of stuff turns green. So there is that ontogenetic color change. So it could be something to do with that, where it comes in with age. Also, in snakes, generally speaking, a lot of snakes anyway, there's 2 different rounds of pigment distribution and production. There's the base layer of pigment that's like right out of the egg. Here's what you got. This stuff's already formed. And then there's a second wave that comes in later with age, which is why when you hatch like a snowball python, it looks pretty freaking white at first, doesn't it? And then as it gets older, there's a second wave of yellow pigment distribution that happens that the mutation did not silence. It comes through and you get this yellowing out of your snow or your exanthics that kind of brown out. It's because of a second wave of yellow pigment. In carpet pythons, they all get a second wave of yellow pigment. That's why jungle carpets hatch out as gray snakes that turn yellow with age. And then they get a second wave of black pigment that comes into that black tipping and smudging that people hate. That's all normal. Bredl's pythons hatch out gray and turn red. They get a second wave of the yellow pigment that manifests as red, and they get a second wave of black pigment that gives them bolder black outlines around their tail and stuff. So it's not always, there's the pigment you hatched with, and then there's the pigment in the successive waves that comes in later. And generally speaking, those other waves of pigment distribution and production are not necessarily governed by the same genes as the primary ones. So this is how you can have an xanthic that gains yellow. You can have this sort of stuff. A hypo that gains black. It's because the second wave was governed by different genes than the first wave was in some of those cases. So that's why you get some of that stuff. So it could be something along those lines.
So the bell complex and ball pythons, you could breed your special to your Mojave, you get your crystal. You could breed your Mojave to your mystic, and you get your mystic potions. You could do mystics to specials. Then you make this really like darker pigment animal, almost has like grays and purples in it. What causes those so many variants on the blue-eyed leucistic allele?
I could not speak to. That is, there's a lot of different ways you can. Well, none of them are leucistic. For one, none of those are truly leucistic animals. None of those qualify as being technically meeting the definition of a true leucistic. They all have
Super Russos?
What? They all have
Super Russo?
They all have some amount of pigment to them. However, some have a lot, some have almost nothing, but they're not. None of them are truly patternless, pure white snakes. Like, get your blacklight out. If you have a blacklight, you're blacklight your snakes. It's really interesting. And it's like blacklighting white snakes and stuff. You're like, "Ooh, look at all that! This all the stuff is underneath there." Like years ago, I used to. I have one because for some of the Bredl's python stuff, the stonewash gene is a piebald mutation, and you can start telling which ones are the hets in certain instances by under a black light. It makes the white scales fluoresce against the background a little bit more, so you can kind of see. You can see it with the naked eye later on in life, but when they're younger, like as a yearling, you can kind of tell if you have a black light. So I've had one out there for years, and I've had some ball pythons. It's been years now where they were, multi-gene. They were white snakes with multiple other genes. They were, white. They were like lesser Mojaves, but they were possible pins, possible X, Y, and Z, and everything. And I think they were super pastel, lesser Mojaves, but half of them statistically should have also been pinstripes. And they all looked like pure white snakes to the naked eye. Black light, it was two pins and one. You could just see clear as shit. Under black light, you could tell those two are pins. You could see this little skinny pinstripe pattern. You couldn't see it with your naked eye at all. But the black light, it fluoresced just a little bit differently, and you could totally see it. I thought, it doesn't make any difference. I just thought it was interesting that it revealed. I remember that I learned that trick years ago because somebody made a blue-eyed leucistic clown. But it was kind of early on in the game, like way back when that was like, way earlier in the timeline of ball pythons than you think that would have hatched. And they figured out whether they somehow figured out under blacklight, you could see the clown pattern. It had it clear as shit, but you couldn't see it unless it was under blacklight. And then all of a sudden, purple, boom, under the blacklight. Like, wow. So I got one permanently mounted in my snake room.
Well, not that lesser clown combos really on, but lesser clown combos were one of the early ones. So, us getting into a leucistic early, and that's kind of not a surprise.
Yeah, it's like this is when people were just figuring out that, like, what? This makes a leucistic? And so does this Mojave? And you breed any of these things together, you make white snakes? There was a point where people were just figuring that out, and there was kind of a fever pitch around things because the Sutherlands had fucked up in a big way. Started selling Mojaves for cheap, not knowing what they had. They did not quantify what they had. So they're selling Mojaves, not having any idea that they're het for leucistic, when at the time there was no Lucy balls, and that was considered the holy grail dream snake that didn't exist. And they're selling hets and didn't know it. And then, the lesser thing happened is like you start figuring out, wait a minute, this kind of then all of a sudden the price started going up even before they'd produced one, just on the speculation it would likely produce that. It was in that sort of era where the whole ball hobby was obsessing about the blue-eyed Lucy complex.
Yellow belly was the same way. Yellow belly was not necessarily a throwaway gene back then, but they were sold very cheap, and then suddenly they found it could make a white-looking snake, and the price skyrocketed.
Yeah, and then I remember when that Jared Hornstein guy made the first super stripe. He bred a yellow belly to a normal and made a super stripe because a Spectre looks like nothing. Looks like nothing. At one point I had a male super specter just because I didn't want to have to figure out which ones were specters because they don't look like anything. I have made a shitload of specters, and even I still couldn't tell you what a specter is supposed to look like. And it looks like nothing. It looks like nothing. It doesn't look like anything. Like the most extreme ones look like a shitty yellow belly, and the rest of them look like absolutely nothing. So it's but man, I mean, now these things that people in the ball python world like just shit on and wouldn't even want to own and wouldn't want to bother to put the feed into, like they have no idea. Like when that super stripe came out, like you would have murdered somebody to get your hands on one of those. That was the absolute, the collective reaction of the hobbies, you just couldn't even believe that could even exist. It was so astounding. And now it's like, who cares? Like, it's like, it was that magnitude of a thing.
I've always said that yellow belly is probably one of the most unique genes you could have in your collection because you can go the white snake route. You can go with all the other super stripe, highway, freeway route. And then just the yellow belly as an enhancer gene in projects now actually makes things significantly better. We never really treated the gene that way up until probably about 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, now it's in everything as it takes everything and just punches it up a little bit.
Just gives it a little something.
Well, I mean, you see this big shift in the hobby in the last. I mean, I have removed myself from the ball python things finally a few years back, but there is finally a trend towards like, oh, we want deep, rich color and contrast instead of just blowing all the paint off the snake, and that's how you get there. You want like dark darks, but light lights, and that contrast and that dynamic sort of look where bright and dark are coming into contact, and that's what makes something that really pops. Because for the previous 15 or 18 years, it was just making snakes that always look the same. It's like, turns out all that old school stuff, anytime you get to 5 genes, it just looks like some sort of super spinner blast, something or other, where you blew 90% of the paint off the snake, and they all kind of look the same. Now you look at it, everything is deep, rich, vibrant colors and contrast, and everything has a way more of a wow factor. The only problem is there's too many things with a wow factor. You're almost overwhelmed by this, like, there's too many amazing snakes. It's like I think people get desensitized to it. There's too many completely outrageous looking things that are just so off the charts crazy that you kind of almost are desensitized to what your threshold for what it takes to impress you gets almost unrealistic because there's so many crazy things.
I think that's where the ball python market right now is when it comes to what someone's willing to invest in an animal. I think so many really off-the-wall animals have been made over the last 5-6 years. You really got to take it up a notch now for someone who want to spend the money on it.
There's the guy in Europe just made some like nearly patternless orange things. Like it's like just solid orange with. You could tell it probably had some pinstripe in it. If you squinted, there was like very faint traces of some thin squiggles.
Yeah. I thought maybe lavender combos of some kind, maybe a lavender clown combo of some kind.
90% patternless orange. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, no, I love that. And then there was that other one because I showed you that one at the same time, but that was like just a solid yellow snake. That was like pinstripe pastel inchy freeway clown, I want to say. Pinstripe, it'll get us.
It's got real dark eyes. I don't know. Will it stay orange? That's the. I mean, it'd be a shame if you make something that looks that amazing and it just turns kind of tan when it gets older or something.
Well, I don't know. They usually brown out, so you get that darker pigment. Maybe that orange gets a little more vibrant with time. Maybe it stays the same. I mean, I'd love to see it in a few years, hopefully. Graphite pieds. You remember the the graphite ivories?
Yeah.
That was the orange belly. I always wonder if that has some kind of like. You've seen the orange belly. You saw the graphites. They look like nothing else. You don't even see them in the industry anymore. You can't find these graphite ivories anywhere. And they look. Go ahead.
Stuff like that tends to get subsumed into everything, absorbed into everything else, and just. I mean, if you're breeding that kind of stuff, and you're breeding it to normals and just making that by itself, it's really obvious it's easy to keep track of, keep it separate. But now nobody does that. Now everybody's 6, 7, 8 genes. There's so much background noise that telling that apart from a regular yellow belly is not possible. It's just like, there's so much going on that picking out the subtle nuances of 2 different lines of the same thing become impossible. I mean, You get enough combo. You can't tell a vanilla from a fire in a 5-gene snake because I've done it myself and couldn't tell. I thought like I couldn't identify a damn thing in that clutch. It's like they're all one or the other, but I couldn't tell you for nothing which one. Like it's there when you have so many other things going on, the totality of it, the small difference just gets overwhelmed.
Yeah. There was another gene I was like, seeing you brought up fire and vanilla was the disco? Was it the super disc? No, not the disco, the sulfur. The sulfur made the black-eyed leucistic, but with a lot of like orange pigment patching, like paradoxing. You know what I'm talking about?
Disco, kind
Super
of.
disco is like that too.
Super disco gets a white snake.
I thought the coolest combo ever was when they bred the disco to the fire and called it the Disco Inferno. Because that's an awesome name. Like I disagree with naming combinations. I think it's extraneous and confusing and unnecessary. But if you're gonna have a name, the Disco Inferno, I thought that was awesome and it was amazing. And I never see them. Like, why would you not want that? Why would you? It's like I thought that was awesome.
Carlos is still working with that gene for sure, disco stuff, and the breeder that started the discos named them discos because his tables at Hamburg were underneath the disco ball.
Good enough.
So that, if you can see it, that's the super sulfur.
Yeah, it's like a black-eyed leucistic pied kind of thing. It's like
So I've always liked that one personally. I don't even know if there's a question there. I mean, I was going to ask you why it happened, but I just couldn't do it.
I think like people can only work with so many projects and so many things, and there's too many things to choose from that things fall through the cracks. Because there's for as many tubs as there are full of ball pythons in the world, and there's a lot, it's like there's just so many possible things to work on that we lose things that fall through the cracks because there's just not enough space to do everything.
Yeah, that's the truth. So I don't know if you can tell, but Junior, he's East Coast time, and it's like 12:30 over there. I think he's done.
Yeah, I just realized it's like 9:30 here, and I haven't even eaten yet.
Yeah, that's fair, man. Junior, if you got anything else, you can throw it in, or you look like you're about done over there.
Falling asleep.
I think we covered a lot of stuff. I haven't been feeling good at all this past week, and so I finally just like the last 10 minutes kind of hit me, getting kind of tired.
No, it's fine. We went 3.5 hours. That was the goal.
That was the goal. That's the goal now.
Well, it's the standard, man. I mean, that's 2 in a row that we've come on that you've gone about 3.5 hours. So I think if it's not 3.5 hours, it just doesn't count.
Right. I think that's the new bar.
Right, that's a good amount of time. Yeah, you're a wealth of knowledge, Nick. Thanks for coming on. It was very insightful and very interesting and very again, insightful conversation. Very good topics, and thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. Are you on Instagram?
I am. I forget to log into it though. Sometimes I'm like, I think I'm almost too old for Instagram. I'm just like right at the cutoff where
my dad.
You're out of here, old man. Like I think I'm like, I forget.
That's fine. That's how I feel about TikTok when grown men send me videos I can't open.
Yeah, I have TikTok just because my sons use TikTok and they'll send me stupid videos that I don't understand. So, but I'm not going to be posting on TikTok. I spend no time scrolling through TikTok.
Neither.
So where can people find you, Nick?
What? I'm the easiest guy in the world to find, actually, and I'm old, so I like answer the phone and stuff.
All right, phone calls.
Super easy to find.
All right. What? So Morph Market. You have Morph Market. You're on.
I do, I guess, because it's kind of like I don't really have a choice anymore about Morph Market. It's kind of like you kind of have to. My website's always up to date, though. I'm so old that I have a website that I actually update. Like I updated it 5 seconds before we logged into this podcast.
Oh, cool!
Like, every day I'm updating it. It's always current. Always.
What's your website?
inlandreptile.com.
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm always on Facebook or whatever. I'm pretty easy to find. Anybody needs to reach me for anything?
Everybody's very happy with the podcast, getting a lot of comments. Yeah, everybody likes it. This is a really good one, and we definitely a lot of people stuck around the whole entire time.
Hearing me ramble about paleoanthropology and all kind of nerdy and the Fermi paradox and
I mean, you have a lot of information. Not everybody's you're very educated. So yeah, you have a lot of experience, education. So yeah, a lot of people stuck around and wanted to hear it, and yeah, it's very informative.
Yeah, I like it. I think we're gonna have to take a couple clips out of here for short videos. I could already think of like 2 things we talked about I loved.
Probably the one where you mentioned like you don't want to get a DNA test because you might want to become a serial killer.
No, we're gonna edit that part out, man. We're gonna.
Well, better to at least he knows that going in. It doesn't make Jeez,
Yeah.
that could be a fatal mistake.
No, that's a solid joke though. That is a good joke.
All right.
Anyway, thanks Nick. Thanks Dave.
All right. Anytime. Glad to be here.
Yeah. See you around.
We'll reach out to Mike for Mike's monitors. We'll set something up soon.
Right on. There we go. It's off.
Sweet.
All right. Have a good one.
All right. See you guys. Bye.
Later, guys. Don't forget to click the like button and subscribe.
Oh, yes. Yeah, please tune in to Morph Market, 9 a.m. MJ, Trap Talk Network, will now have every Friday, 9 a.m. scheduled episodes on Morph Market, sharing reptile news, market information, things about Morph Market, breeders, interviews, all of it. So next one's going to be 9 a.m. Friday, and I'll actually be on there, December 20th. So thanks, everybody, and thanks, Dave.